The figure of Orpheus emerges from the complex tapestry of Greek mythology as one of antiquity's most compelling and enduring characters, whose origins reflect the intricate religious and cultural dynamics of the ancient Mediterranean world. Understanding his genealogy requires navigating through multiple traditions that developed across different Greek regions, each offering distinct perspectives on his divine heritage and mortal connections. The most widely accepted classical tradition establishes Apollo, the god of music, poetry, prophecy, and the sun, as Orpheus's father. This paternal lineage carries profound significance, as Apollo represented the pinnacle of artistic achievement and divine inspiration in the Greek pantheon. The god's mastery of the lyre, his role as leader of the Muses, and his association with harmony and order provided the mythological foundation for Orpheus's extraordinary musical abilities. Apollo's influence extended beyond mere artistic talent. It encompassed the power to heal, to prophesy, and to bridge the mortal and divine realms through sacred song. Calliope, identified as Orpheus's mother in the majority of classical sources, held the distinguished position of chief among the 9 Muses and presided specifically over epic poetry. Her domain encompassed the grandest forms of literary expression, including heroic verse and the preservation of cultural memory through narrative song. The union between Apollo and Calliope represented a convergence of musical excellence and poetic mastery, creating the perfect genealogical foundation for a figure destined to transcend ordinary human limitations through artistic expression. Calliope's influence manifested not only in Orpheus's musical abilities, but also in his later role as a religious teacher and the supposed author of numerous mystical texts. This divine parentage, however, represents just one strand of a more complex mythological tradition. Various Greek regions developed alternative genealogies that reflected local religious practices and historical connections. In Thracian traditions, particularly those preserved in northern Greece, Eurydice appears as Orpheus's mortal father. Eurydice, described as a king of Thrace, provided a more earthly connection to the legendary musician's origins, while maintaining the divine element through Calliope's continued role as mother. This version of Orpheus's parentage created a hybrid nature, part divine through his mother's lineage, part mortal through his father's humanity. The Eurydice tradition carried particular weight in regions where Thracian cultural influence remained strong. Historical evidence suggests that Thracian religious practices, including ecstatic rituals and mystery cults, significantly influenced Greek religious development. By positioning Eurydice as Orpheus's father, these traditions created a direct link between the legendary musician and the actual historical and cultural landscape of Thrace, lending credibility to claims about Orpheus's civilizing influence on the region's tribal societies. Additional genealogical variants emerged in different parts of the Greek world. Some sources identified the river god Hebrus as Orpheus's father, connecting him directly to the sacred geography of Thrace. The Hebrus River, flowing through the heart of Thracian territory, held religious significance and was associated with various mystery cults. This aquatic paternity emphasized the flowing, life-giving nature of Orpheus's music while anchoring his origins to a specific geographical location that audiences could identify and visit. Thrace itself played a crucial role in shaping Orpheus's mythological identity. The region located in what is now southeastern Europe encompassed parts of modern Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. Ancient Greeks viewed Thrace as a land of wild beauty and primitive power, inhabited by fierce tribes who practiced ecstatic religious rituals that both fascinated and unsettled more southern populations. The region's reputation for producing exceptional musicians and poets made it a natural birthplace for a figure of Orpheus's caliber. Archaeological evidence from Thracian sites reveals a sophisticated culture with strong musical traditions. Elaborate burial goods include numerous musical instruments, suggesting that music played a central role in both daily life and religious observance. Thracian goldwork frequently depicts musicians and musical scenes, indicating that the region's association with exceptional musical ability had historical foundations beyond mere mythological invention. The early manifestations of Orpheus's supernatural abilities became the stuff of legend throughout the ancient world. According to the mythological accounts, his musical talent emerged almost immediately after birth, surpassing even the considerable abilities inherited from his divine parentage. The infant Orpheus reportedly could calm savage beasts with his voice alone, while his first attempts at playing the lyre produced melodies of such beauty that flowers bloomed out of season and rivers altered their courses to listen. These early demonstrations of power extended beyond simple entertainment. Ancient sources describe how Orpheus's music could influence the natural world in profound ways. Trees would uproot themselves and follow the sound of his lyre, creating impromptu forests wherever he chose to perform. Wild animals, normally hostile to human presence, would gather peacefully around him, their predatory instincts suspended by the transformative power of his melodies. Even inanimate objects responded to his music, with stones reportedly arranging themselves into harmonious patterns and metals reshaping themselves into pleasing forms. The young Orpheus's abilities also manifested in more subtle ways that would prove significant for his later religious role. His music could heal emotional wounds, resolve conflicts between individuals, and inspire profound spiritual experiences in listeners. These early demonstrations established patterns that would define his adult ministry and influence the development of Orphic religious traditions. Thrace's cultural significance extended far beyond its role as Orpheus's birthplace. The region served as a crucial meeting point between Greek civilization and the broader world of northern European cultures. Thracian religious practices, characterized by ecstatic rituals and mystery initiations, profoundly influenced Greek religious development. The cult of Dionysus, with its emphasis on transcendence through ritual intoxication and mystical experience, drew heavily from Thracian traditions. The historical Thrace was also notable for its mineral wealth, particularly gold and silver deposits that funded sophisticated artistic production. Thracian metalworkers created elaborate ceremonial objects that combined Greek artistic influences with local traditions, producing works of exceptional beauty and craftsmanship. This material culture provided a realistic foundation for stories about a land where extraordinary artistic achievement was possible and expected. Orphic traditions, the religious and philosophical movements that claimed Orpheus as their founder, found particularly fertile ground in Thracian cultural soil. These traditions emphasized personal salvation through mystical knowledge, ritual purification, and direct experience of the divine. The Orphic emphasis on music as a path to spiritual enlightenment reflected actual Thracian religious practices, where rhythmic music and dance played central roles in achieving altered states of consciousness. The relationship between historical Thracian culture and the mythological figure of Orpheus created a complex interplay between fact and legend. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal aspects of Thracian civilization that illuminate the cultural context from which Orpheus emerged. Elaborate tombs contain musical instruments alongside other grave goods, suggesting that musicians held high social status. Religious sites show evidence of ritual practices involving music and dance, supporting ancient accounts of Thracian religious intensity. The geographical features of Thrace also contributed to Orpheus's mythological development. The region's dramatic landscapes, including deep forests, rushing rivers, and imposing mountains, provided natural settings for stories about supernatural musical performances. The interplay between civilization and wilderness that characterized Thracian culture became a central theme in Orpheus's mythology, as his music represented the power of art to civilize and harmonize even the wildest aspects of nature. The divine musician's origins thus reflect a sophisticated synthesis of religious, cultural, and geographical elements that gave depth and credibility to his mythological persona. His parentage, whether purely divine or mixed divine and mortal, positioned him as a mediator between different realms of existence. His Thracian birth connected him to a real culture known for its musical excellence and religious intensity, while his early manifestations of supernatural ability established the foundation for his later roles as hero, teacher, and religious founder. The transformation of Orpheus from a divinely gifted child into the supreme musician of the ancient world began with his inheritance of Apollo's most sacred instrument. The golden lyre that came into Orpheus's possession was no ordinary musical device, but rather a cosmic instrument whose creation involved the collaborative efforts of multiple deities. Hermes had originally crafted the first lyre from a tortoise shell, but Apollo's version transcended this primitive prototype through divine enhancement and celestial tuning. The instrument's 7 strings corresponded to the 7 celestial spheres, each producing tones that resonated with fundamental forces governing the universe. The lyre's supernatural properties manifested immediately upon Orpheus's first contact with the instrument. Ancient sources describe how the golden strings hummed with inherent power even when untouched, generating harmonics that seemed to emanate from the cosmic order itself. The tortoiseshell resonator, transformed through divine craftsmanship, amplified not merely sound, but the very essence of harmony that maintained universal balance. When Orpheus first drew his fingers across these strings, witnesses reported that the air itself seemed to shimmer with visible music, creating patterns of light that danced in rhythm with the melodies. The instrument's ability to influence the physical world exceeded anything previously witnessed in mortal hands. Unlike conventional lyres that produce sound through vibrating strings and resonating chambers, Apollo's gift operated through direct manipulation of the fundamental frequencies that governed matter itself. When Orpheus played, the molecular structures of nearby objects responded to these cosmic harmonies, causing stones to rearrange themselves into aesthetically pleasing configurations and trees to bend their branches in graceful arcs that complemented the musical phrases. Contemporary accounts from ancient historians describe specific instances where Orpheus's lyre demonstrated its extraordinary capabilities. In one documented performance near Mount Olympus, massive granite boulders reportedly rolled themselves into a natural amphitheatre formation, creating perfect acoustic properties for the music. The stones arranged themselves according to mathematical principles that enhanced sound reflection and eliminated unwanted echoes, suggesting that the lyre's influence extended beyond mere physical movement to encompass sophisticated understanding of acoustic engineering. The development of Orpheus's musical skills progressed through stages that reflected both intensive training and supernatural enhancement. His early education under Apollo's direct supervision involved not merely technical instruction, but initiation into the cosmic principles underlying all musical expression. Apollo taught his son that music was not entertainment, but rather a fundamental force capable of maintaining or disrupting the ordered relationships between gods, mortals, and the natural world. This education included theoretical knowledge about harmonic ratios, practical training in advanced performance techniques, and mystical instruction in channeling divine power through musical expression. The progression of Orpheus's abilities followed patterns that distinguished him from other legendary musicians of the ancient world. While figures like Amphion of Thebes could move stones to build city walls, and Arion of Methymna could summon dolphins through song, Orpheus's capabilities encompassed and exceeded all previous musical achievements. His development involved mastering not only the technical aspects of lyre performance, but also learning to access and direct the cosmic forces that his instrument could channel. Training sessions with Apollo took place in various divine locations, each offering unique acoustic properties and spiritual challenges. The sacred groves of Delphi provided settings where Orpheus learned to harmonize his music with prophetic inspiration, creating songs that could reveal hidden truths and future events. At the Castalian Spring, he practiced compositions that could purify listeners of spiritual contamination and prepare them for divine encounters. These diverse training environments contributed to the remarkable versatility that characterized his mature musical style. The supernatural aspects of Orpheus's musical education involved learning to perceive and manipulate the underlying harmonic structures that governed natural phenomena. Apollo instructed his son in recognizing the musical patterns inherent in seasonal changes, celestial movements, and biological processes. This knowledge enabled Orpheus to create compositions that could influence these natural cycles, accelerating plant growth, calming storms, or even temporarily altering the flow of time within limited areas. As Orpheus's skills matured, his performances began to attract attention from both mortal and divine audiences. Gods would descend from Olympus to hear his concerts, while mortals travelled vast distances to experience music that transcended ordinary human capabilities. These audiences provided opportunities for Orpheus to test and refine his abilities, discovering new ways to apply his musical powers to address various challenges and needs. The legendary accounts of Orpheus's ability to calm savage animals became central to his mythological reputation. These stories, while often embellished through repeated telling, appear to have foundations in observable phenomena that ancient witnesses interpreted through their understanding of divine intervention. When Orpheus performed in wilderness settings, predatory animals would indeed abandon their hunting behaviour and gather peacefully around him, creating scenes that defied natural law and common sense. The mechanism behind this animal calming ability involved more than simple auditory pleasure. Ancient sources suggest that Orpheus's music operated at frequencies that directly influenced the neurological systems of various animal species. Lions, bears, wolves, and other dangerous creatures would approach his performance areas with their aggressive instincts completely suppressed, sitting calmly alongside their natural prey while the music continued. This effect persisted for considerable periods after performances ended, with reports of former enemies sharing water sources and grazing areas for days following Orpheus's concerts. Detailed accounts describe specific instances where this animal calming ability proved practically beneficial. During his travels through remote regions, Orpheus could ensure safe passage for himself and companions by performing brief musical interludes that neutralized potential threats. Shepherds and farmers in areas where he performed reported dramatic reductions in livestock predation, as local wolf packs and other predators maintained peaceful behaviour patterns for extended periods after exposure to his music. The influence extended beyond mammals to include various other animal categories. Birds would alter their migration patterns to remain within audible range of Orpheus's performances, creating unprecedented gatherings of diverse species that normally occupied different geographical regions. Fish would swim upstream against powerful currents to reach areas where his music could be heard through water, while insects would form elaborate aerial patterns that complemented the visual aspects of his performances. The ability to stop rivers and redirect their courses represented another dimension of Orpheus's supernatural musical powers. Ancient hydraulic engineering was sophisticated enough for contemporary observers to recognize when water behavior violated natural principles, lending credibility to accounts of Orpheus's influence over flowing water. Rivers would indeed slow their currents, change direction, or even flow backward when subjected to specific musical compositions that Orpheus had developed for this purpose. These aquatic manipulations involved understanding the relationship between sound frequencies and fluid dynamics. Orpheus learned to create musical patterns that generated standing wave formations in flowing water, effectively creating temporary dams or redirecting channels through acoustic interference. The practical applications included providing water for drought-stricken communities, creating safe river crossings, and even draining flooded areas by encouraging water to flow toward alternative outlets. Mountain-moving abilities, while perhaps the most spectacular of Orpheus's legendary powers, appear to have involved more subtle geological influences than literal displacement of massive landforms. Ancient accounts describe how his music could trigger controlled landslides, open new mountain passes, and even stimulate volcanic activity in dormant regions. These effects likely resulted from his ability to generate sound frequencies that resonated with existing geological stress patterns, providing the additional energy needed to trigger changes that were already geologically probable. The religious significance of music as a bridge between mortal and divine realms permeated ancient Greek theological understanding. Music was not considered merely artistic expression, but rather a fundamental force that maintained cosmic order and enabled communication between different levels of existence. This theological framework provided the conceptual foundation for understanding how Orpheus's musical abilities could transcend normal physical limitations and produce effects that seemed to violate natural law. Greek religious thought recognized music as the language through which gods communicated with mortals, and the medium through which mortals could approach divine understanding. Sacred hymns, ritual chants, and ceremonial music served as vehicles for spiritual transformation, enabling participants to transcend ordinary consciousness and experience direct contact with divine forces. Orpheus's exceptional abilities represented the ultimate development of these musical spiritual principles, demonstrating the full potential of music as a bridge between realms. The theological implications of Orpheus's musical powers extended beyond individual spiritual experience to encompass broader cosmic responsibilities. His ability to influence natural phenomena through music positioned him as a mediator between divine will and earthly reality, capable of implementing divine intentions through musical intervention. This role required not only technical mastery, but also deep understanding of divine purposes and careful judgment about when and how to exercise his extraordinary capabilities. The recruitment of Orpheus for Jason's legendary quest to obtain the Golden Fleece from Colchis represented a calculated decision that reflected the expedition's organizers' understanding of the supernatural challenges they would face. Jason, son of Aeson and rightful heir to the throne of Iolcos, recognized that his mission would require more than conventional heroic strength and martial prowess. The oracle at Delphi had cryptically warned that success would depend upon harmonizing discordant elements, a prophecy that led Jason's advisors to seek a figure capable of wielding music as both weapon and diplomatic tool. The invitation reached Orpheus while he was residing in the sacred groves near Mount Parnassus, where he had been composing hymns for the Temple of Apollo. Messengers from Jason described the expedition's ambitious scope and the diverse crew of heroes already committed to the voyage. The roster included Heracles with his superhuman strength, Castor and Polydeuces with their boxing and horsemanship skills, Atalanta with her unmatched archery abilities, and Tiphys who would serve as the ship's navigator. However, Jason specifically emphasized that the expedition needed someone who could address challenges that physical prowess alone could not overcome. The mythological tradition preserved in Apollonius of Rhodes's Argonautica, composed in the 3rd century BC, provides the most detailed ancient account of Orpheus's role in the expedition. Apollonius drew upon earlier sources, including works by Pindar and other classical poets, to create a comprehensive narrative that balanced heroic adventure with sophisticated literary technique. His version presents Orpheus not merely as a passenger, but as an integral member of the crew, whose contributions proved essential to the mission's success. Archaeological evidence from various Mediterranean sites has revealed artifacts that may relate to historical voyages that inspired the Argonaut legend. Bronze Age pottery fragments found along the Black Sea coast displayed decorative motifs that matched descriptions of the Argo's distinctive design, while ancient harbour installations in regions associated with the mythological voyage show evidence of accommodating ships of unusual size and construction. These discoveries suggest that the Argonautic expedition, while mythologically embellished, may have been based on actual maritime expeditions that occurred during the Late Bronze Age. The construction of the Argo itself involved supernatural assistance, with the goddess Athena providing timber from the sacred oak grove at Dodona. This divine wood possessed oracular properties, enabling the ship to communicate warnings and guidance to its crew during critical moments. Orpheus's musical abilities proved particularly valuable in interpreting these wooden prophecies, as his divine heritage allowed him to understand the subtle tonal variations through which the ship conveyed its messages. The crew's initial assembly at the port of Pagasae revealed the complex dynamics that would characterize the entire voyage. Heroes accustomed to individual glory had to learn collaborative techniques, while personalities that had never encountered equals suddenly found themselves surrounded by peers of comparable ability. Orpheus's first major contribution involved creating musical compositions that helped forge unity among these diverse and potentially conflicting characters. His evening performances around the ship's cooking fires became crucial bonding experiences that transformed a collection of individual heroes into a cohesive expedition team. The departure from Pagasae required careful timing to take advantage of favourable winds and currents, but also to ensure divine approval for the mission. Orpheus composed and performed elaborate hymns honouring Poseidon, Athena, and other deities whose support would prove essential during the voyage. These ceremonial performances served both religious and practical purposes, as the musical offerings helped secure divine protection while also providing final opportunities for crew members to practice coordinated responses to Orpheus's musical directions. The early stages of the voyage tested the crew's ability to function as a unit while navigating waters that grew increasingly unfamiliar as they progressed eastward. The Aegean Sea presented relatively familiar challenges, but even these routine sailing conditions revealed how Orpheus's musical contributions enhanced the expedition's effectiveness. His work songs helped coordinate rowing rhythms during periods of calm weather, while his weather prediction compositions enabled the crew to prepare for storms before conventional signs became apparent. The first major supernatural challenge occurred during the encounter with the Sirens, whose deadly song had destroyed countless previous voyages. These creatures, described in ancient sources as having the bodies of birds with human heads, possessed voices of such compelling beauty that sailors would abandon their ships to swim towards certain death on the rocky shores where the Sirens dwelt. The mythological tradition preserved multiple accounts of their appearance and abilities, with some sources describing them as former companions of Persephone who'd been transformed as punishment for failing to prevent her abduction. The Siren's song operated through supernatural compulsion that bypassed rational thought and directly influenced the listener's will. Ancient accounts describe how their voices could mimic the sounds of loved ones calling for help, create auditory illusions of approaching rescue ships, or simply generate melodies so beautiful that death seemed preferable to living without hearing them again. Ships that encountered the Sirens typically found their crews abandoning all navigation duties to steer directly toward the source of the song, resulting in shipwrecks on the jagged rocks that surrounded the Sirens' island. Orpheus's counter-strategy involved creating musical compositions that could compete directly with the Sirens' supernatural allure. This required not merely producing louder or more beautiful music, but developing harmonic structures that could neutralize the specific frequencies through which the Sirens exercised their compulsion. His preparations began days before the expected encounter, as he composed and rehearsed complex musical pieces designed to create acoustic interference patterns that would disrupt the Sirens' effectiveness. The actual confrontation demonstrated the sophistication of Orpheus's musical understanding and the power of his divine instrument. As the Argo approached the Sirens' island, the crew could hear the beginning notes of the deadly song drifting across the water. The melody started as a barely audible whisper that seemed to promise answers to each listener's deepest longings and most pressing questions. Several crew members began to show signs of the characteristic siren-induced trance, with glazed expressions and movements toward the ship's rail. Orpheus responded by launching into his prepared counter-melody, using his golden lyre to generate harmonics that created constructive and destructive interference with the siren's song. The mathematical precision required for this musical combat exceeded anything previously attempted, as he had to maintain perfect pitch relationships while continuously adjusting his composition to match the siren's changing tactics. The result was a complex acoustic battle that created shifting patterns of sound across the water, with areas of reinforced harmony alternating with zones of complete silence. The effectiveness of Orpheus's intervention became apparent as crew members who had been succumbing to the siren's influence gradually returned to normal consciousness. His music did not simply overpower the siren's song, but rather created a protective acoustic environment that allowed the crew to hear both musical performances without being compelled by either. This approach enabled the Argonauts to appreciate the legendary beauty of the sirens' voices while remaining free to choose their own course of action. The success of this musical confrontation established Orpheus's reputation as the expedition's primary defense against supernatural threats. Word of his victory over the sirens spread among the crew and reinforced their confidence in his ability to address challenges that conventional heroic methods could not handle. The encounter also demonstrated the strategic value of his divine heritage and specialized training, as no mortal musician could have achieved the precise acoustic control necessary to neutralize the siren's power. Throughout the voyage, Orpheus's musical interventions proved essential during various other challenges that tested the expedition's resolve and unity. Storm management became one of his most frequently utilized skills, as Mediterranean weather patterns could change rapidly and create dangerous conditions for even the most seaworthy vessels. His storm-calming compositions worked by generating sound frequencies that influenced atmospheric pressure patterns, creating localized areas of reduced wind intensity and calmer seas around the Argo. The mechanism behind these meteorological interventions involved understanding the relationship between acoustic waves and atmospheric dynamics. Orpheus learned to identify the harmonic frequencies that corresponded to different weather patterns and could create musical compositions that either reinforced stable conditions or disrupted the formation of dangerous storms. His weatherworking abilities required careful timing and precise execution, as mistimed interventions could worsen existing conditions or create new meteorological hazards. Crew management represented another area where Orpheus's musical abilities proved invaluable. The extended duration of the voyage, combined with the stress of facing unknown dangers and the personality conflicts inevitable among strong-willed heroes, created numerous situations where diplomatic intervention became necessary. Orpheus developed specialized compositions that could influence emotional states, reducing aggression during heated arguments and promoting cooperation during challenging tasks. These psychological interventions operated through the same principles that enabled his animal calming abilities, using specific frequencies and rhythmic patterns that influenced neurological activity. His music could reduce stress hormones, promote the release of endorphins that enhanced mood, and create shared emotional experiences that strengthened group cohesion. The effectiveness of these techniques made him an unofficial mediator for disputes and a crucial figure in maintaining expedition morale. The historical analysis of the Argonautica reveals how different ancient sources emphasized various aspects of Orpheus's contributions to the expedition. Apollonius of Rhodes focused primarily on the dramatic encounters with supernatural threats, presenting Orpheus as a heroic figure whose musical abilities functioned as weapons against mythological dangers. Earlier sources, including fragments preserved from Pindar and other archaic poets, place greater emphasis on his role as a civilizing influence who helped transform a band of individual warriors into a coordinated expedition team. The scholarly tradition that developed around the Argonautic cycle recognized the expedition as a foundational myth that established patterns for later heroic narratives. Orpheus's participation provided a model for how intellectual and artistic abilities could complement physical prowess in achieving objectives that required diverse skills and approaches. This integration of different heroic types reflected broader cultural developments in ancient Greek society, where specialized knowledge and technical expertise gained recognition alongside traditional martial virtues. Modern archaeological investigations have identified several Black Sea locations that may correspond to sites mentioned in the Argonautic accounts. Coastal settlements showing evidence of Greek contact during the Bronze Age have yielded artifacts that match descriptions of trade goods and cultural exchanges described in the mythological sources. While these discoveries cannot confirm the historical reality of the specific expedition described in the Argonautica, they demonstrate that the geographical and cultural context presented in the ancient sources reflects actual conditions that existed during the period when the myths were supposedly set. The preservation of the Argonautic tradition through multiple ancient sources indicates the story's importance in Greek cultural memory and its function as a vehicle for exploring themes that remained relevant across different historical periods. Orpheus's role within this tradition established him as more than simply a musician, positioning him as a figure whose abilities enabled him to address challenges that required understanding of cosmic principles and supernatural forces that governed the world beyond ordinary human experience. The return of Orpheus from the Argonautic expedition marked the beginning of a transformative period in his life, as the divine musician sought to establish a more settled existence in the pastoral landscapes of Thrace. The heroic adventures with Jason's crew had enhanced his reputation throughout the Greek world, but the constant dangers and supernatural challenges of the voyage had left him yearning for the peaceful rhythms of his homeland. The rolling hills and dense forests of Thrace, with their abundant wildlife and crystal-clear streams, provided the perfect environment for a musician whose powers drew their strength from harmony with the natural world. It was during this period of renewed connection with his native region that Orpheus first encountered Eurydice, a nymph whose beauty and grace would forever alter the trajectory of his existence. The meeting occurred in a secluded grove sacred to the nature deities, where ancient oak trees formed a natural cathedral with their interwoven branches. Eurydice belonged to the classification of dryads, tree nymphs who maintained intimate connections with specific groves or individual trees, serving as guardians and embodiments of the forest's vital essence. Her particular domain encompassed a cluster of silver birch trees, whose leaves created shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance in response to her movements. The circumstances of their first meeting reflected the deep connection both figures shared with the natural world. Orpheus had been drawn to the grove by reports of unusual musical phenomena. Shepherds spoke of hearing ethereal melodies emanating from the forest during dawn and dusk hours, songs that seemed to emerge from the trees themselves, rather than any visible performer. His investigation of these mysterious sounds led him through increasingly dense woodland until he reached the heart of the sacred grove, where the acoustic properties created by the surrounding trees produced natural amplification and resonance effects. Eurydice's initial appearance struck Orpheus as the perfect embodiment of sylvan grace and natural beauty. Ancient sources describe her as possessing the characteristic features of her nymphal nature: skin with the pale luminescence of birch bark, hair that shifted colour like autumn leaves moving through seasonal changes, and eyes that reflected the deep green of forest shadows. Her movements displayed the fluid elegance typical of woodland spirits, each gesture seeming to follow the rhythm of wind through branches or water flowing over stones. The courtship that developed between Orpheus and Eurydice unfolded against the backdrop of Thrace's most beautiful natural settings. Their relationship progressed through shared explorations of remote valleys where wildflowers bloomed in unprecedented profusion, mountain meadows where streams created natural amphitheatres with perfect acoustic properties, and forest clearings where moonlight filtered through leaves to create intimate spaces for musical performances. These pastoral encounters allowed both figures to express their deepest connections to the natural world, while discovering how their individual natures complemented each other. Orpheus found in Eurydice a companion who could truly appreciate the subtle complexities of his musical art. Unlike mortal audiences who were often overwhelmed by the supernatural power of his performances, Eurydice possessed the sensitivity to perceive the intricate relationships between his melodies and the natural phenomena they influenced. She could detect how specific musical phrases encouraged flower blooms, how certain harmonic progressions affected the behaviour of woodland creatures, and how the overall structure of his compositions reflected and enhanced the seasonal cycles that governed forest life. Eurydice's own abilities, while more modest than Orpheus's divine gifts, demonstrated a profound understanding of natural harmony that perfectly complemented his musical powers. Her connection to the birch grove allowed her to perceive the health and emotional states of all vegetation within her domain, enabling her to guide Orpheus toward locations where his music could have the most beneficial effects. She could sense when drought threatened particular areas, when plant diseases required intervention, or when the natural balance of predator and prey populations needed adjustment through musical influence. The development of their relationship also revealed how Eurydice's presence enhanced Orpheus's own abilities in unexpected ways. When she accompanied him during performances, the natural world responded with greater enthusiasm and precision than when he played alone. Trees would lean closer to hear his music, flowers would bloom in more vibrant colours, and even the quality of light filtering through forest canopies seemed to improve during their joint appearances. This synergistic effect suggested that their union represented more than simple romantic attraction. It embodied a fundamental harmony between different aspects of natural and artistic expression. The wedding celebration of Orpheus and Eurydice became a legendary event that demonstrated the couple's unique relationship with both divine and natural realms. The ceremony took place in the same sacred grove where they had first met, with the ancient oak trees serving as natural pillars for a forest cathedral that required no human construction. Divine guests descended from Olympus to witness the union, while representatives from every category of nature spirit attended to honour the bride and groom. Apollo himself presided over the ceremony, performing the traditional rituals that sanctified the marriage while adding musical elements that reflected his son's extraordinary nature. The god's blessing took the form of a complex musical composition that wove together themes representing Orpheus's divine heritage, Eurydice's connection to the natural world, and the harmonious future their union promised to create. This ceremonial music established harmonic patterns that would influence the couple's relationship throughout their married life, creating resonances that strengthened their emotional bond and enhanced their individual abilities. The guest list for the wedding included figures from across the spectrum of Greek mythological society. The 9 muses attended in their full ceremonial regalia, each contributing specialised performances that honoured different aspects of artistic and intellectual achievement. Calliope, as Orpheus's mother, delivered an epic poem that traced the genealogical connections linking the couple to various divine lineages and prophesied the influence their descendants would have on future cultural developments. Nature deities arrived in unprecedented numbers to celebrate Eurydice's marriage and witness the union between divine music and natural beauty. Pan brought his retinue of satyrs and woodland spirits, who performed rustic dances that complemented the more refined musical offerings provided by the Olympian guests. River gods and naiads emerged from their aquatic domains to attend the ceremony, while mountain spirits descended from their elevated homes to participate in the festivities. The wedding feast featured delicacies that reflected both divine and natural abundance. Ambrosia and nectar provided by the Olympian guests were complemented by fruits and nuts that the forest itself offered as wedding gifts. Streams temporarily flowed with wine, while trees produced unusual varieties of fruit that existed only during this magical celebration. The abundance demonstrated how the marriage between Orpheus and Eurydice represented a new level of harmony between different realms of existence. The brief period of marital bliss that followed their wedding represented a golden age in both Orpheus's personal life and his artistic development. The couple established their primary residence in a grove that combined the best features of both their individual domains: ancient trees that provided the acoustic properties Orpheus needed for his most ambitious compositions, alongside the specific vegetation that Eurydice required to maintain her nymphal connection to the natural world. This shared home became a centre of artistic and natural activity that attracted visitors from throughout the known world. Their daily routine reflected the perfect integration of their complementary natures and abilities. Morning hours were typically devoted to collaborative explorations of their surrounding territory, during which Eurydice would identify areas where natural harmony needed enhancement, while Orpheus developed musical interventions to address these needs. These joint expeditions often resulted in dramatic improvements to local ecosystems, with previously barren areas blooming into fertility and disturbed habitats returning to balanced states. Afternoon periods were reserved for individual artistic pursuits that allowed each partner to develop their specialized abilities while remaining within the supportive environment of their shared domain. Orpheus used these hours for composing new musical works that incorporated insights gained from his relationship with Eurydice, creating pieces that achieved unprecedented levels of integration between human artistry and natural beauty. His compositions from this period displayed a subtlety and sophistication that surpassed even his earlier masterworks, reflecting how his marriage had deepened his understanding of the cosmic principles underlying all harmonious relationships. Eurydice devoted her individual time to expanding her influence within the natural world, using techniques she had learned from observing Orpheus's methods to extend her protective abilities beyond her original birch grove domain. Her enhanced capabilities enabled her to serve as guardian for increasingly large areas of forest, ensuring that the natural harmony created by their collaborative efforts would persist even when they were not physically present to maintain it directly. Evening hours provided opportunities for the couple to combine their abilities in performances that became legendary throughout the ancient world. These sunset concerts attracted audiences that included both mortal visitors and supernatural beings, creating gatherings that transcended the normal boundaries between different categories of existence. The music produced during these joint performances achieved effects that neither Orpheus nor Eurydice could accomplish individually, demonstrating how their marriage had created new possibilities for artistic expression and natural influence. The character of Eurydice, as depicted in classical literature, reveals the sophisticated understanding ancient authors possessed regarding the relationship between human artistry and natural beauty. Virgil's treatment of her story in the Georgics, composed during the 1st century BC, presents her as more than simply a beautiful nymph who becomes the object of Orpheus's affection. Instead, Virgil portrays Eurydice as an active participant in the agricultural and pastoral activities that form the foundation of civilized life, emphasizing her role as a mediator between wild nature and human cultivation. Virgil's Eurydice possesses knowledge of agricultural techniques that complement Orpheus's musical abilities, creating a partnership that benefits both natural ecosystems and human communities. Her understanding of plant growth cycles, soil fertility, and seasonal variations enables her to guide farmers and herders toward practices that enhance productivity while maintaining environmental balance. This practical wisdom, combined with her supernatural abilities as a dryad, positions her as an essential figure in the development of sustainable agricultural practices that would support growing human populations without destroying the natural world. The Georgics present the marriage between Orpheus and Eurydice as representing the ideal relationship between human culture and natural resources. Their partnership demonstrates how artistic sensitivity and environmental awareness can work together to create abundance that benefits all forms of life. Virgil's treatment emphasizes the educational aspects of their relationship, showing how Eurydice's natural wisdom enhances Orpheus's divine gifts, while his musical abilities amplify her influence over natural processes. Ovid's portrayal of Eurydice in the Metamorphoses, written during the early 1st century AD, offers a different perspective that emphasizes the transformative power of love and the tragic vulnerability that accompanies even the most perfect relationships. Ovid's Eurydice embodies the classical ideal of feminine beauty and grace, while possessing the strength and independence characteristic of supernatural beings. His treatment explores how her relationship with Orpheus changes both partners, revealing new dimensions of their personalities and capabilities that might never have emerged without their mutual influence. The Ovidian Eurydice demonstrates remarkable courage and resourcefulness in situations that would overwhelm ordinary mortals, yet she also displays the emotional sensitivity that makes her vulnerable to the tragic circumstances that will eventually destroy her happiness. Ovid's psychological insight reveals how the intensity of her love for Orpheus creates both the greatest joy and the greatest potential for suffering in her existence, establishing the emotional foundation for the tragedy that will transform their story from one of perfect happiness to one of ultimate loss. Later classical authors, including Apollodorus and various scholiasts who preserved fragments of earlier works, contributed additional details that enriched the portrayal of Eurydice's character and emphasized different aspects of her relationship with Orpheus. These sources often focused on her role as an inspiration for Orpheus's greatest musical achievements, suggesting that the artistic works he created during their marriage period represented the highest level of creative expression possible for mortal or divine artists. The symbolic interpretation of the union between Orpheus and Eurydice, as representing the marriage of art and natural beauty, became a central theme in ancient literary criticism and philosophical analysis. This symbolic reading recognized that their relationship embodied fundamental principles governing the relationship between human creativity and environmental harmony, demonstrating how artistic expression could serve as a bridge between civilized society and the natural world that sustained all life. The marriage represented the successful integration of opposing forces that typically existed in tension within both individual psychology and social organization. Orpheus's divine heritage and supernatural abilities symbolized the transcendent aspects of human creativity that could rise above material limitations and achieve effects that seemed to violate natural law. Eurydice's connection to the natural world represented the grounding influence that prevented artistic expression from becoming disconnected from the practical needs and environmental realities that shaped everyday existence. Their successful partnership demonstrated that these apparently opposing forces could work together harmoniously when approached with proper understanding and mutual respect. The artistic achievements that resulted from their collaboration showed how human creativity could enhance rather than exploit natural beauty, while the environmental improvements that followed their joint efforts proved that natural processes could support and amplify human artistic expression when the relationship was properly managed. The idyllic period of Orpheus and Eurydice's marriage faced its first serious threat from an unexpected source when Aristaeus, the divine son of Apollo and the nymph Siren, encountered Eurydice during one of her solitary wanderings through the Thracian countryside. Aristaeus held dominion over numerous aspects of rural life, including beekeeping, olive cultivation, and the protection of flocks, making him a significant figure among the agricultural deities who governed pastoral activities throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. His divine status as Apollo's son created a complex familial relationship with Orpheus, as both shared the same divine father, though their mothers came from entirely different realms of existence. Archaeological evidence from various ancient sites reveals the widespread veneration of Aristaeus throughout regions where agriculture and animal husbandry form the foundation of economic life. Inscriptions found in rural sanctuaries across Greece, Sicily and Sardinia document elaborate festivals held in his honour, featuring competitions in beekeeping techniques, olive oil production, and livestock breeding. These celebrations often included musical performances that honoured his civilizing influence on rural communities, though none approached the supernatural artistry that characterized Orpheus's divine gifts. The historical Aristeas represented the practical application of divine knowledge to everyday agricultural problems, earning him recognition as a culture hero who introduced essential techniques for food production and resource management. Ancient sources credit him with teaching mortals how to construct proper beehives, establish olive groves in previously unsuitable terrain, and develop breeding programs that improved the quality of domestic animals. His contributions to human civilization complemented but differed significantly from Orpheus's artistic and spiritual influence, creating potential areas of both cooperation and conflict between the two divine half-brothers. The fateful encounter between Aristeas and Eurydice occurred during late spring, when the young nymph had ventured beyond her usual forest domain to gather rare medicinal herbs that bloomed only in specific mountain meadows. These expeditions formed part of her regular duties as a guardian spirit, as she needed to maintain detailed knowledge of all plant species within her expanded territory, to effectively protect the natural balance that sustained the region's ecological health. The particular meadow where she encountered Aristeas was renowned for producing flowers whose petals could be processed into remedies for various ailments affecting both humans and animals. Aristeas had been travelling through the same region while investigating reports of mysterious bee colony collapses that threatened local honey production and the pollination cycles essential for fruit tree cultivation. His divine responsibilities required him to identify and address any factors that disrupted the agricultural systems under his protection, making these investigative journeys a regular aspect of his duties. The timing of his presence in the remote meadow was not coincidental, but rather reflected his systematic approach to monitoring the health of rural ecosystems throughout his domain. The initial meeting between Aristeas and Eurydice appeared cordial, as both recognized each other's divine nature and legitimate reasons for being present in the isolated location. Ancient sources suggest that their conversation initially focused on technical matters related to the environmental changes affecting the region, with Eurydice sharing observations about plant health patterns, while Aristeas described the unusual behaviour he had observed among local bee populations. This professional exchange revealed shared concerns about ecological disruptions that were affecting both their respective domains. However, the interaction took a dramatically different turn when Aristeas became captivated by Eurydice's extraordinary beauty and began pursuing objectives that extended far beyond their initial environmental discussions. The nymph's graceful movements and luminous appearance, enhanced by her supernatural connection to the natural world, created an immediate and overwhelming attraction that caused the bee god to abandon his usual measured approach to interpersonal relationships. His divine nature, while granting him significant powers over agricultural processes, did not provide immunity to the emotional impulses that could affect any conscious being when confronted with exceptional beauty. The transformation of Aristeas's behaviour from professional courtesy to aggressive pursuit reflected patterns of divine conduct that frequently appeared in Greek mythological narratives. Gods and goddesses regularly demonstrated how their supernatural abilities could amplify both positive and negative human characteristics, creating situations where divine figures became capable of both extraordinary benevolence and destructive obsession. Aristeas's pursuit of Eurydice exemplified this mythological pattern, showing how even deities associated with beneficial agricultural activities could become dangerous when their desires conflicted with the wishes of their intended targets. Eurydice's initial response to Aristeas's unwanted attention demonstrated both the diplomatic skills she had developed through her relationship with Orpheus and the practical wisdom that characterized her approach to potentially dangerous situations. She attempted to redirect the conversation toward their shared environmental concerns, while gradually moving toward the forest edge, where her supernatural abilities would provide greater protection against unwanted advances. Her strategy reflected understanding that direct confrontation with a divine figure of Aristeus's power level could escalate into violence that might endanger not only herself but also the natural system she was sworn to protect. The failure of Eurydice's diplomatic approach became apparent when Aristeus interpreted her attempts at redirection as encouragement rather than polite rejection. His persistence in pursuing romantic objectives despite her clear lack of interest revealed the dangerous combination of divine power and unchecked desire that could transform beneficial deities into threats against the very communities they were supposed to protect. The situation deteriorated rapidly as Aristeus began using his supernatural abilities to prevent Eurydice's retreat, manipulating local bee swarms to create barriers that blocked her access to escape routes. The chase that ensued when Eurydice finally abandoned diplomatic strategies and attempted direct flight became a terrifying demonstration of how quickly divine encounters could turn deadly for even supernatural beings of considerable power. Aristeus pursued her across increasingly difficult terrain, using his connection to agricultural animals and insects to track her movements and anticipate her likely destinations. His ability to communicate with various animal species provided him with information about her location, even when she managed to temporarily evade direct visual contact. Eurydice's flight path took her through a series of natural environments where her own supernatural abilities provided varying degrees of protection and assistance. Within forested areas, her connection to tree spirits enabled her to move with exceptional speed and agility, using knowledge of hidden paths and natural obstacles to maintain distance from her pursuer. However, when the chase moved into open meadowlands and agricultural areas where Aristeus's influence was strongest, she found her advantages significantly reduced and her options for escape increasingly limited. The specific meadow where the tragedy occurred was located in a transitional zone between wild forest and cultivated farmland, creating an environment where neither Eurydice nor Aristeus could claim complete supernatural dominance. Ancient sources describe the location as particularly beautiful, with wildflowers growing in natural patterns that created a tapestry of colours across the landscape. A small stream meandered through the meadow, providing water for the abundant plant life while creating the moist soil conditions that supported the diverse ecosystem characterizing the region. The fatal snake that would end Eurydice's life had been resting in the tall grass near the stream bank, following the typical behavior patterns of the venomous species that inhabited the region during warm weather periods. The serpent belonged to a variety known for its aggressive defensive responses when disturbed, possessing venom potent enough to kill even supernatural beings who lacked specific immunities to its toxic effects. Its presence in the meadow was entirely natural and unconnected to any divine intervention or supernatural manipulation by either Aristeus or other mythological figures. Eurydice's desperate flight through the meadow grass, driven by panic and the need to escape Aristeus's pursuit, create exactly the type of sudden disturbance that would provoke a defensive strike from the concealed serpent. Her supernatural senses, normally capable of detecting potential dangers in natural environments, were overwhelmed by the stress of the chase and the need to focus on evading her divine pursuer. The combination of fear, exhaustion and divided attention created conditions that prevented her from noticing the snake's presence until the moment of contact. The snakebite occurred on Eurydice's ankle as she attempted to leap across the stream that bisected the meadow. The serpent's fangs penetrated her supernatural flesh, injecting venom that immediately began spreading through her system despite her nymphal constitution. Ancient sources describe how the poison created a burning sensation that rapidly progressed up her leg, causing weakness and disorientation that made continued flight impossible. Within moments of the bite, Eurydice collapsed beside the stream, her strength failing as the venom overwhelmed her body's natural defences. The immediate aftermath of the snake bite revealed the tragic irony that characterised many Greek mythological narratives. Aristeus, witnessing Eurydice's collapse, immediately abandoned his pursuit and attempted to provide assistance, using his knowledge of natural remedies and divine healing techniques to counteract the serpent's venom. His efforts demonstrated genuine concern for her welfare and remorse for his role in creating the circumstances that led to her injury, but his healing abilities proved insufficient to address the specific type of toxin that was destroying her system. Eurydice's death occurred with a swiftness that shocked even Aristeus, whose experience with agricultural accidents had familiarized him with various types of injuries and poisonings that could affect both humans and animals. The venom's effects progressed through identifiable stages, beginning with localized pain and swelling, advancing to systemic weakness and respiratory distress, and culminating in complete circulatory collapse that ended her physical existence. Her final moments were marked by a gradual fading of the luminous quality that had characterized her supernatural appearance, as her connection to the natural world dissolved with her departing life force. The transformation of Eurydice's body following her death reflected the complex relationship between nymphal spirits and their physical manifestations in the material world. Unlike mortal beings whose bodies remained as corpses after death, Eurydice's form began dissolving into natural elements that returned to the environment from which they had originally emerged. Her flesh became flower petals that scattered in the wind. Her hair transformed into grass that immediately took root in the meadow soil, and her blood became a small spring that bubbled up from the ground near the location where she had fallen. The discovery of Eurydice's death by Orpheus occurred several hours after the tragic event, when his growing concern about her delayed return from the herb-gathering expedition prompted him to begin searching for her location. His supernatural senses, enhanced by their marital bond and his divine heritage, enabled him to track her movements across the landscape and eventually led him to the meadow where the fatal encounter had occurred. The scene he discovered there would forever alter his understanding of mortality, loss, and the limitations that even divine power could not overcome. Orpheus's initial response to finding evidence of his wife's death combined disbelief with desperate hope that his musical abilities might somehow reverse what had occurred. He began playing compositions designed to call Eurydice back to physical existence, using harmonic structures that had previously proven effective in healing injuries and restoring life to damaged ecosystems. His music filled the meadow with sounds of such beauty and power that flowers bloomed out of season and the stream temporarily reversed its flow, but these supernatural effects could not restore his beloved wife to life. The realization that Eurydice was truly dead struck Orpheus with a force that exceeded any suffering he had previously experienced during his heroic adventures with the Argonauts, or his various encounters with supernatural dangers. The loss represented not merely the death of someone he loved, but the destruction of the perfect harmony that their marriage had created between divine artistry and natural beauty. His grief encompassed both personal anguish and cosmic despair, as he recognized that the universe had become fundamentally less harmonious with Eurydice's departure from existence. The immediate expression of Orpheus's grief took the form of musical compositions that achieved new levels of emotional intensity and supernatural power. His laments filled the air with melodies so profoundly sorrowful that they affected every living creature within audible range, causing birds to fall silent, animals to weep, and trees to shed their leaves despite the season. These songs of mourning demonstrated how his divine abilities could channel personal emotion into artistic expression that transcended individual experience and became a universal statement about the nature of loss and suffering. The variations in ancient sources regarding the specific circumstances of Eurydice's death reflect different cultural emphases and regional traditions that shaped how the story was preserved and transmitted across various Greek communities. Virgil's account in the Georgics emphasizes the agricultural context of the tragedy, presenting Aristeus's pursuit as connected to broader themes about the relationship between human desires and natural consequences. This version positions the story within a framework that explores how individual actions can disrupt ecological balance and create unintended consequences that affect entire communities. Ovid's treatment in the Metamorphoses focuses more heavily on the psychological aspects of the tragedy, exploring how grief and loss can transform even divine beings and drive them to attempt actions that challenge the fundamental order of existence. His version emphasizes the transformative power of love and loss, showing how Eurydice's death changes not only Orpheus, but also the natural world that responds to his musical expressions of grief. This approach connects the personal tragedy to broader themes about change, transformation, and the persistence of beauty even in the face of destruction. Later classical sources, including various scholiasts and mythographers, preserved alternative versions that emphasized different aspects of the story's significance for ancient audiences. Some traditions suggested that Eurydice's death was predetermined by fate, and that Aristeus's pursuit merely provided the immediate cause for an event that would have occurred regardless of specific circumstances. These versions explored themes related to destiny, divine will, and the limitations that even supernatural beings faced when confronting the ultimate reality of mortality. The cultural significance of Eurydice's death story extended beyond its function as entertainment or moral instruction to encompass deeper questions about the relationship between civilization and nature, the role of desire in creating both beauty and destruction, and the ways that individual tragedies could illuminate universal truths about the human condition. Ancient audiences recognized in this narrative a sophisticated exploration of themes that remained relevant across different historical periods and social contexts, ensuring its preservation and continued retelling through multiple generations of poets, historians, and religious teachers. The discovery of Eurydice's lifeless form in that remote meadow shattered Orpheus's understanding of his own divine capabilities, and forced him to confront the ultimate limitation that even supernatural power could not overcome. His initial attempts to revive her through increasingly desperate musical interventions had failed completely, leaving him face to face with a reality that challenged everything he believed about the relationship between harmony and existence. The silence that followed his final, futile composition marked the end of one phase of his grief and the beginning of a far more dangerous resolution that would transform him from a figure of creative beauty into an active challenger of cosmic order itself. The decision to enter Hades alive represented an unprecedented violation of the fundamental boundaries that separated the realm of the living from the domain of the dead. No mortal or divine being had previously attempted such a journey with the explicit intention of retrieving a deceased soul and returning it to physical existence. The Underworld served specific cosmic functions that required absolute separation between life and death, ensuring that the natural cycles governing existence could continue without disruption from beings who refused to accept mortality's finality. Orpheus's plan challenged not merely practical obstacles, but the theological foundations that maintained universal stability. Ancient sources describe the psychological transformation that preceded Orpheus's decision to undertake this impossible quest. His grief evolved beyond simple mourning into a consuming obsession that gradually displaced all other considerations from his consciousness. The divine musician who had once created harmony between opposing forces now found himself driven by a single purpose that admitted no compromise or alternative solutions. His music, previously characterized by its ability to integrate diverse elements into unified compositions, became focused entirely on themes of loss, separation, and the desperate need for reunion with his beloved wife. The practical preparations for his underworld journey required extensive research into the geography and customs of Hades, information that was not readily available to living beings, but could be pieced together from various sources. Orpheus consulted with spirits of the recently deceased who had not yet completed their transition to the underworld, gathering intelligence about the challenges he would face and the protocols that governed interaction with infernal authorities. These conversations revealed the complex bureaucratic structure that administered the realm of the dead, with multiple checkpoints and guardian figures who served specific functions in processing souls and maintaining order. The selection of his golden lyre as his only weapon and tool for the journey reflected both practical necessity and symbolic significance. Physical weapons would prove useless against supernatural guardians who existed beyond the reach of conventional violence, while his divine instrument represented the one force that had previously proven capable of influencing beings and phenomena that seemed beyond mortal reach. The lyre's cosmic properties, derived from its creation by divine craftsmen and its attunement to universal harmonic principles, provided the theoretical foundation for believing that even the powers governing death might respond to properly applied musical intervention. The geographical approaches to the underworld varied according to different regional traditions, with multiple locations throughout the ancient Mediterranean world claiming to serve as entrance points to the realm of the dead. The most commonly referenced access point was located near Lake Avernus in southern Italy, where volcanic activity created an otherworldly landscape of steaming waters and sulphurous vapours that seemed to connect the surface world with subterranean realms. Ancient writers described how the lake's toxic fumes killed birds that flew too close to its surface, creating a zone of death that served as a natural boundary between the world of the living and the domain of eternal shadows. Archaeological investigations at Lake Avernus have revealed extensive ancient installations that appear designed to facilitate religious ceremonies and ritual activities connected to underworld worship. Stone platforms positioned along the shoreline provided spaces for offerings and sacrificial rituals, while underground chambers carved into the surrounding cliffs may have served as temporary shelters for individuals preparing to undertake spiritual journeys or mystical initiations. These physical remains suggest that the location's association with underworld access reflected actual religious practices rather than purely literary invention. Alternative entrance points mentioned in classical sources included caves and chasms located in various mountainous regions, particularly those associated with volcanic or seismic activity that created natural openings into underground spaces. The cave at Cape Tanarum in southern Greece served as another traditional gateway, where a narrow opening in coastal cliffs led to underground passages that ancient visitors believed connected directly to Hades. Local traditions maintained that the sound of rushing water could be heard deep within these passages, possibly representing one of the infernal rivers that formed boundaries within the underworld's geography. The oracle at Delphi provided Orpheus with cryptic guidance about the optimal timing and approach for his unprecedented journey. The Pythia's pronouncements emphasized the importance of musical preparation and warned about specific dangers that would require careful navigation to avoid permanent entrapment in the realm of the dead. These oracular instructions included recommendations about ritual purifications that would protect him from the corrupting influences of the underworld environment, as well as specific melodic patterns that might prove effective in communicating with various categories of infernal beings. The actual descent began during the darkest phase of a new moon, when the boundary between worlds was believed to be at its thinnest and most permeable to extraordinary interventions. Orpheus approached the chosen entrance point carrying only his lyre and wearing simple garments that would not impede his movement through the underground passages he expected to encounter. His divine heritage provided some protection against the immediately lethal effects that exposure to underworld atmosphere typically produced in mortal beings, but even his supernatural constitution would face severe challenges during extended residence in an environment designed to accommodate only the dead. The initial stages of his descent took him through natural cave systems that gradually transitioned from familiar geological formations to supernatural constructions that defied normal physical principles. The walls began displaying phosphorescent properties that provided dim illumination without any apparent source, while the air itself became thicker and more oppressive as he progressed deeper underground. Strange sounds echo through the passages, distant wailing, the clash of metal against stone, and an underlying rhythm that seemed to pulse in harmony with some cosmic heartbeat that regulated the underworld's functions. The first supernatural guardian Orpheus encountered was Charon, the ancient ferryman whose responsibility involved transporting souls across the river Styx that formed the primary boundary between the upper world and the true underworld. Classical sources describe Charon as an aged figure of intimidating appearance, with wild grey hair, burning eyes, and clothing that seemed woven from shadows themselves. His ferry, constructed from materials that existed only in the underworld, could accommodate the insubstantial forms of deceased souls, but had never been designed to carry living beings whose physical density might disrupt its supernatural buoyancy. Charon's initial response to Orpheus's arrival demonstrated the rigid protocols that governed underworld operations and the ferryman's commitment to maintaining the established order that prevented unauthorized crossings. The Guardian's refusal to provide passage reflected not personal hostility, but professional duty to ensure that only properly deceased souls gained access to the realm beyond the Styx. His challenges to Orpheus included demands for proof of death, payment in the form of coins traditionally placed on corpses' eyes, and explanations for why a living being sought entry to a domain specifically designed to exclude all forms of active life. The musical performance that ultimately convinced Charon to provide passage represented one of Orpheus's most sophisticated applications of his divine abilities to a practical problem, requiring both technical excellence and psychological insight. His composition needed to address the ferryman's professional concerns while appealing to whatever emotional responses remained accessible within his ancient consciousness. The melody began with themes that acknowledged the legitimate authority Charon exercised over river crossings, demonstrating respect for the Guardian's position, while gradually introducing harmonic elements that evoked the universal experiences of loss and longing that even immortal beings could understand. The effectiveness of Orpheus's musical intervention became apparent as Charon's stern expression gradually softened, and his rigid posture began to relax in response to melodies that seemed to awaken memories of emotions he'd not experienced for countless centuries. The ferryman's eyes, normally burning with cold fire, began to show traces of the compassion that had characterized his nature. Before endless exposure to death and suffering had hardened his heart against all forms of sympathy. His hands, accustomed only to grasping the oars that propelled his ferry across the dark waters, began to move in rhythm with the music's gentle cadences. The river Styx itself responded to Orpheus's performance in ways that revealed the cosmic significance of his musical abilities and their capacity to influence even the fundamental structures that maintained universal order. The dark waters, normally flowing with inexorable current that carried souls toward their eternal destinations, began to slow their movement and reflect light that had no apparent source. The oppressive atmosphere that typically surrounded the river started to clear, allowing glimpses of distant shores that were usually hidden by supernatural mists and shadows. Ancient descriptions of the Styx emphasize its role as more than simply a geographical barrier between different realms of existence. The river served as a cosmic boundary that maintained the separation between life and death, ensuring that the natural cycles governing existence could continue without disruption from beings who refused to accept their proper place within the universal order. Its waters possessed properties that could dissolve the connections binding souls to their previous existences, facilitating the transition from active life to the passive state required for residence in the underworld. The crossing of the Styx aboard Charon's ferry provided Orpheus with his first direct experience of the underworld's unique environmental conditions and their effects on living beings who are not designed to survive in such circumstances. The atmosphere grew progressively more oppressive as they moved away from the shore, while strange lights flickered beneath the water's surface, suggesting the presence of countless souls who had made this same journey throughout the ages. The ferry itself seemed to respond to the presence of a living passenger, by moving more slowly and requiring greater effort from Charon to maintain its proper course. The far shore of the Styx opened onto a vast plain where newly arrived souls gathered in groups, according to the circumstances of their deaths and their destinations within the Underworld's complex geography. Ancient sources describe this area as resembling an enormous waiting area, where the deceased underwent processing that determined their ultimate fates within the realm of the dead. Administrative structures built from materials that seem to absorb rather than reflect light house the bureaucratic apparatus that managed the constant flow of souls, requiring classification and assignment to appropriate eternal residences. The second major guardian Orpheus encountered was Cerberus, the three-headed hound whose massive form blocked access to the deeper regions of the underworld, where Hades maintained his palace, and the more significant souls served their eternal sentences. Classical descriptions of this creature emphasize not only its intimidating size and supernatural strength, but also its intelligence and loyalty to its duties as gatekeeper for the most secure areas of the realm of the dead. Each of Cerberus's three heads possessed independent consciousness, while sharing a unified purpose of preventing unauthorized passage beyond the checkpoint it guarded. Ancient artistic representations of Cerberus, found on pottery, coins, and architectural decorations throughout the Greek world, reveal the creature's significance as a symbol of the underworld's power and the finality of death's dominion over mortal existence. These depictions typically show a dog of enormous proportions with three distinct heads, each bearing different expressions that reflect various aspects of its guardian function. Some heads appear alert and watchful, scanning for potential intruders, while others display aggressive snarls that warn against attempts to bypass their authority through force or deception. The confrontation between Orpheus and Cerberus represented a test of musical power against supernatural ferocity that would determine whether artistic beauty could overcome the fundamental hostility that the underworld maintained toward all forms of active life. The creature's initial response to the approaching musician involved the typical aggressive displays that had proven effective in deterring previous unauthorized visitors. All three heads began growling in harmonized patterns that created subsonic vibrations capable of inducing terror in most conscious beings, while the creature's massive body tensed in preparation for physical combat that would quickly destroy any ordinary intruder. Orpheus's musical strategy for addressing this challenge required careful analysis of Cerberus's nature and the specific frequencies that might influence a creature whose consciousness operated on multiple simultaneous levels. His composition needed to address each head individually while maintaining overall harmonic unity that could coordinate their responses and gradually transform aggressive impulses into more peaceful attitudes. The technical complexity of this musical challenge exceeded anything he had previously attempted, requiring simultaneous manipulation of multiple melodic lines that could function independently while contributing to a unified emotional effect. The performance began with gentle melodies that acknowledged Cerberus's legitimate authority, while gradually introducing harmonic elements designed to evoke the creature's memories of companionship and loyalty that had originally motivated its service to Hades. As the music continued, each of the three heads began responding differently to specific melodic themes, with their aggressive expressions slowly transforming into expressions of curiosity and eventually something resembling contentment. The massive body that had been tensed for combat began to relax, and the creature's tail started moving in rhythm with the musical phrases. The success of Orpheus's intervention with Cerberus demonstrated the universal appeal of properly applied musical beauty and its capacity to reach even the most hardened consciousnesses when presented with sufficient skill and genuine emotional content. The three-headed guardian, whose existence had been devoted entirely to preventing passage and maintaining the security of the underworld's inner regions, found itself responding to artistic expression that awakened feelings of peace and harmony it had never previously experienced. The creature's transformation from aggressive guardian to willing audience illustrated the fundamental power of music to transcend barriers that seemed absolute and unchangeable. The deeper regions of the underworld that lay beyond Cerberus's checkpoint revealed the full complexity of the realm's geography and the sophisticated administrative systems that managed the eternal fates of countless souls. Ancient sources describe vast chambers carved from living rock, their walls decorated with scenes depicting the various categories of punishment and reward that awaited different types of souls based on their earthly conduct. Rivers of fire provided illumination, while creating barriers that separated different sections of the underworld according to the specific requirements of their inhabitants. The Elysian fields, reserved for souls who had achieved exceptional virtue during their mortal existences, occupied regions where supernatural light created an eternal springtime atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the oppressive darkness characterizing most underworld territories. Here, the greatest heroes, poets, and philosophers of previous ages continued their pursuits in an environment that provided all the beauty and intellectual stimulation they had sought during life, but without the physical limitations and temporal constraints that had restricted their earthly achievements. Tartarus, the deepest and most secure section of the underworld, housed souls whose crimes had been so severe that they required eternal punishment under conditions of maximum security and suffering. The geography of this region included features specifically designed to prevent escape and ensure that the torments inflicted upon its inhabitants could continue indefinitely without interruption. Rivers of molten metal flowed through chambers where the most notorious criminals of history served sentences that matched the magnitude of their earthly offences. The administrative centre of the underworld, where Hades maintained his throne and conducted the judicial proceedings that determined souls' ultimate destinations, occupied a vast palace complex that demonstrated the sophisticated organisational systems required to manage the eternal fates of all deceased beings. The architecture combined elements of intimidation and grandeur, creating an environment that reinforced the absolute authority of the underworld's ruler while providing the practical facilities needed for processing the constant flow of souls requiring judgment and assignment. The throne room of Hades represented the culmination of underworld architecture, designed to embody the absolute authority of Death's dominion, while serving the practical functions required for administering eternal justice. The chamber stretched across dimensions that seemed to exceed normal spatial limitations, with walls of polished obsidian rising to heights that disappeared into shadows no light could penetrate. Massive columns carved from single blocks of black marble supported a ceiling decorated with constellations that moved in patterns reflecting the cosmic order governing both life and death. The floor consisted of intricately fitted stones that formed geometric patterns radiating outward from the central dais where the twin thrones of the underworld's rulers commanded attention from every angle. Hades himself occupied the primary throne, a construction of dark metals and precious stones that reflected his status as sovereign over all deceased souls and guardian of the earth's mineral wealth. Ancient sources describe his appearance as combining the dignity expected of a major Olympian deity with the sombre characteristics appropriate to his dominion over death. His beard, dark as the deepest cave shadows, framed features that conveyed both wisdoms accumulated through eons of experience and the stern resolve necessary for making irreversible decisions about souls' eternal fates. His clothing consisted of robes woven from materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an appearance that suggested both royal magnificence and the absolute finality of death itself. Persephone's throne, positioned beside her husband's seat but designed to reflect her unique dual nature as both Queen of the Underworld and daughter of Demeter, incorporated elements that acknowledged her connection to both death and agricultural fertility. The craftsmanship combined precious metals with organic materials that somehow maintained their vitality despite the underworld's hostile environment to all forms of active life. Her appearance reflected the complex mythology surrounding her abduction by Hades and subsequent role as co-ruler of the realm of the dead. Ancient artists typically portrayed her as maintaining the beauty that had originally attracted Hades' attention, while displaying the authority and wisdom she had acquired through her experiences as Queen of the Underworld. The court assembled to witness Orpheus's unprecedented petition included representatives from every category of Underworld administration, creating an audience that encompassed the full range of supernatural beings involved in managing the eternal fates of deceased souls. The three judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, occupied positions of honor reflecting their responsibility for determining the ultimate destinations of souls based on their earthly conduct. These figures, renowned for their wisdom and incorruptible judgment during their mortal existences, had been appointed to their eternal positions based on their demonstrated ability to render fair decisions in complex moral situations. The Furies, ancient goddesses whose function involved pursuing and punishing those who had committed crimes that violated fundamental moral principles, attended the proceedings with particular interest in how Orpheus's request might affect their ongoing responsibilities. Alecto, Megara, and Tisiphone had spent countless eons tracking down criminals who believed they could escape justice through death, ensuring that their punishments continued in the underworld with appropriate intensity and duration. Their presence at the court session reflected the potential implications of granting Orpheus's petition for the broader systems of divine justice that maintained moral order throughout the universe. Representatives of the various rivers that formed geographical and administrative boundaries within the underworld occupied designated areas according to their specific functions in the realm's operations. The personification of Lethe, whose waters cause souls to forget their previous existences, observed the proceedings with particular attention to how Eurydice's potential return to life might affect the careful balance between memory and forgetfulness that enabled souls to adapt to their new circumstances. The spirits of Acheron, Cocytus, and Phlegethon maintained similar interest in how precedent-setting decisions might influence their roles in processing and transporting souls throughout the underworld's complex geography. Orpheus's entry into this august assembly created an immediate disruption of the solemn atmosphere that typically characterized official underworld proceedings. His living presence introduced elements of warmth, color, and vitality that contrasted sharply with the eternal stillness that normally pervaded the throne room. The golden lyre he carried seemed to generate its own illumination, casting light that revealed details of the chamber's architecture and decoration that were usually hidden in shadow. His breathing, heartbeat, and other signs of active life created subtle sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in an environment accustomed only to the whispered movements of insubstantial souls. The formal presentation of his petition followed protocols that had been established for addressing the underworld's rulers, though no previous case had involved a living being seeking to reverse death's dominion over a specific individual. Orpheus approached the twin thrones with the respectful demeanour appropriate for addressing deities of Hades and Persephone's stature, while maintaining the dignified bearing that reflected his own divine heritage as Apollo's son. His initial words acknowledged the legitimate authority of the underworld's rulers over their domain, while explaining the unprecedented circumstances that had driven him to attempt this impossible intervention. The content of Orpheus's spoken petition emphasized the injustice of Eurydice's premature death and the exceptional circumstances that had led to her fatal encounter with the serpent. He described how her demise had resulted not from any moral failing or natural completion of her life cycle, but from a tragic accident that occurred while she was attempting to escape unwanted advances from Aristeus. This argument positioned her death as an unnatural disruption of cosmic harmony rather than the inevitable conclusion of a mortal existence, providing theoretical justification for considering an exception to the normally absolute finality of death. The legal and theological complexities of Orpheus's request required careful consideration of precedents and principles that governed the relationship between life and death throughout the universe. Ancient Greek religious thought recognized death as serving essential cosmic functions that maintained the proper order of existence, ensuring that the cycles of birth, growth, decay, and renewal could continue without disruption from beings who refused to accept their natural limitations. Granting exceptions to death's finality could potentially undermine these fundamental systems and create chaos that might threaten the stability of both mortal and divine realms. However, the specific circumstances of Eurydice's death and Orpheus's unique qualifications as a divine musician, whose abilities transcended normal limitations, created a situation that fell outside the established categories for addressing such requests. His demonstrated capacity to influence natural phenomena through musical intervention suggested that he might possess the power necessary to maintain the delicate balance between life and death that would be required if his petition were granted. The question facing the Underworld's rulers involved determining whether the risk of setting a dangerous precedent outweighed the potential benefits of correcting what appeared to be a genuine cosmic injustice. The musical performance that followed Orpheus's formal petition represented the culmination of his artistic development and the most sophisticated application of his divine abilities to a practical problem, requiring both technical excellence and profound emotional communication. His composition needed to address multiple audiences simultaneously: the rational concerns of the Underworld's administrative officials, the emotional responses of souls who had experienced similar losses, and the cosmic principles that governed the relationship between harmony and existence throughout the universe. The technical challenges involved in creating music that could function effectively at all these levels exceeded anything previously attempted by mortal or divine musicians. The opening phrases of Orpheus's performance established melodic themes that acknowledged the legitimate concerns of his audience, while gradually introducing harmonic elements designed to evoke universal experiences of love, loss, and the desire for reunion that transcended the boundaries between different categories of existence. His golden lyre responded to his emotional intensity by generating tones of unprecedented beauty and power, creating resonances that seemed to emanate from the cosmic order itself, rather than merely from the instrument's physical construction. The music filled the vast throne room with sounds that revealed new dimensions of acoustic possibility, while maintaining perfect clarity and emotional directness. The initial response from the assembled court demonstrated the immediate impact of Orpheus's musical intervention on beings who had become accustomed to the emotional numbness that characterized extended residence in the realm of the dead. Souls who had not experienced genuine feeling for centuries found themselves moved to tears by melodies that awakened memories of their own mortal loves and losses. The administrative officials whose duties required them to maintain professional detachment from the suffering they witnessed daily began showing signs of the compassion that had originally motivated their service to divine justice before endless exposure to tragedy had hardened their hearts. The three judges of the dead, renowned for their impartial evaluation of moral evidence and their immunity to emotional manipulation, found their carefully maintained objectivity challenged by music that seemed to reveal new aspects of the cases they had adjudicated throughout their eternal service. Minos, whose experience included judging the most complex moral situations from throughout human history, began reconsidering previous decisions as Orpheus's melodies illuminated the emotional contexts that legal frameworks often failed to address adequately. Rhadamanthus and Aeacus experienced similar responses as the music revealed dimensions of justice and mercy that their systematic approaches had not previously encompassed. The Furies, whose existence was devoted entirely to pursuing and punishing moral violations, underwent the most dramatic transformation as Orpheus's performance continued. Alecto's expression, normally fixed in patterns of righteous anger against criminals who'd escaped earthly justice, began softening as the music awakened memories of the protective love that had originally motivated her commitment to defending innocent victims. Megaera and Tisiphone experienced similar changes as melodies designed to evoke compassion and forgiveness gradually displaced the consuming hatred that had driven their endless pursuit of wrongdoers throughout the ages. The most significant response came from the tormented souls whose eternal punishments had been temporarily suspended by the unprecedented beauty of Orpheus's music. In Tartarus, where the most notorious criminals in history served sentences specifically designed to match the magnitude of their earthly offences, the sounds of his lyre penetrated barriers that had been constructed to prevent any relief from their suffering. Tantalus, condemned to eternal hunger and thirst with food and water, perpetually just beyond his reach, found his desperate grasping temporarily stilled as the music provided the first satisfaction he had experienced since his punishment began. Sisyphus, forever rolling his massive boulder up a steep incline only to watch it roll back down each time he neared the summit, paused in his labours as Orpheus's melodies created a moment of peace that transcended the futility that had defined his existence for countless eons. The boulder itself seemed to respond to the music by remaining stationary on the slope, creating a brief respite that allowed Sisyphus to experience hope for the first time since his punishment commenced. This temporary suspension of his eternal task demonstrated the cosmic power contained within Orpheus's musical expression and its capacity to influence even the most fundamental structures maintaining universal order. Ixion, bound to a fiery wheel that spun continuously through the Underworld's atmosphere as punishment for his attempted assault on Hera, found his wheel's rotation gradually slowing as the music's harmonious patterns counteracted the chaotic forces that maintained his torment. The flames that had burned him ceaselessly for ages began to diminish in intensity, while the dizziness and disorientation that had prevented him from maintaining coherent thought started to clear for the first time since his punishment began. His lucid moments during this musical interlude allowed him to experience genuine remorse for his crimes, rather than simply enduring their consequences. The Danaids, condemned to fill leaking vessels with water for eternity as punishment for murdering their husbands, discovered that their jars temporarily retained the water they poured during Orpheus's performance. This suspension of their futile labour provided them with their first experience of accomplishment and progress since their punishment commenced, creating emotional responses they had not felt for countless centuries. The simple satisfaction of completing their assigned task, even temporarily, awakened memories of the purposeful activity that had characterized their mortal existences before their crimes had condemned them to eternal frustration. Hades himself, whose position required him to maintain absolute authority over the realm of the dead, while ensuring that the cosmic functions of death continued without disruption, found his carefully controlled emotions stirred by music that seemed to reveal new dimensions of the love and loss that had shaped his own relationship with Persephone. The melodies awakened memories of his initial courtship and the complex negotiations that had been required to establish their marriage, while respecting Demeter's legitimate concerns about her daughter's welfare. The music also evoked his understanding of the seasonal separations that required Persephone to spend portions of each year in the upper world, creating periods of loneliness that he had learned to endure but never to enjoy. Persephone's response proved even more dramatic, as Orpheus's music resonated with her unique experience of existing simultaneously in two different realms and maintaining relationships that bridged the boundary between life and death. Her dual nature as both queen of the underworld and daughter of the agricultural goddess Demeter had created an understanding of loss and reunion that enabled her to appreciate the full emotional complexity of Orpheus's petition. The music awakened her memories of her own traumatic separation from her mother, and the gradual development of love for Hades despite the circumstances of their initial meeting. The theological implications of the court's response to Orpheus's performance revealed fundamental questions about the nature of divine justice and the relationship between mercy and cosmic order that had not been adequately addressed by previous religious traditions. Ancient Greek thought typically portrayed the gods as maintaining strict adherence to established principles that governed universal stability, with exceptions granted only under circumstances that would not threaten the broader systems maintaining cosmic harmony. Orpheus's case presented a situation where strict adherence to these principles might actually create greater cosmic disruption than granting the requested exception. The precedent-setting nature of any decision regarding Eurydice's return to life created implications that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of her death and Orpheus's grief. Granting his petition might encourage other bereaved individuals to attempt similar interventions, potentially overwhelming the Underworld's administrative systems and undermining the finality of death that served essential functions in maintaining natural cycles. However, refusing his request might suggest that divine justice was inflexible and incapable of addressing genuine cosmic injustices when they occurred within the established framework of universal law. The religious significance of this episode in ancient Greek theological thought centered on questions about the relationship between individual suffering and cosmic necessity that had profound implications for understanding divine nature and moral responsibility. The gods' response to Orpheus's petition would reveal whether divine justice included provisions for addressing situations where adherence to established principles might create outcomes that violated deeper moral truths about the nature of love, loss, and the value of individual existence within the broader cosmic order. The silence that followed Orpheus's performance stretched across the throne room like a held breath, broken only by the distant echoes of his final notes reverberating through the obsidian walls. Hades remained motionless on his throne, his dark eyes fixed on the divine musician, whose unprecedented petition had just transformed the eternal stillness of his realm into something approaching the emotional turbulence of mortal existence. Persephone leaned forward slightly, her hands gripping the armrests of her throne as she struggled with conflicting impulses that reflected her dual nature as both queen of the underworld and a goddess who retained vivid memories of her own traumatic separation from the world above. The administrative machinery of the underworld had ground to a complete halt during Orpheus's performance, with souls suspended mid-journey across the various rivers. Punishments temporarily ceased throughout Tartarus, and the normal processing of newly arrived dead completely abandoned, as every conscious being in the realm focused entirely on the music that had revealed new possibilities for mercy within a system designed around absolute finality. The judges of the dead sat in unprecedented confusion, their centuries of experience in moral evaluation suddenly seeming inadequate to address a situation that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between justice and compassion. Hades finally broke the silence with words that carried the weight of cosmic authority, while revealing the profound impact that Orpheus's music had made on his normally implacable consciousness. His decision to grant the petition represented a departure from established precedent that would require careful conditions to prevent the complete breakdown of the systems governing death and resurrection throughout the universe. The god's voice resonated through the chamber with tones that combined the absolute authority of his position with an unexpected quality of understanding that suggested genuine appreciation for the love that had motivated Orpheus's impossible journey. The conditions that Hades imposed on Eurydice's return reflected both practical necessity and symbolic significance that would test Orpheus's commitment to his beloved, while maintaining the cosmic balance that prevented death from losing its essential function in universal order. The primary restriction required Orpheus to lead Eurydice from the underworld without looking back at her until both had completely emerged into the sunlight of the upper world. This apparently simple requirement carried profound theological implications, as it demanded that Orpheus demonstrate absolute faith in the god's promise, while resisting the natural human impulse to verify that his beloved was indeed following behind him. The psychological complexity of this condition extended beyond mere obedience to divine authority to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of trust, love, and the relationship between certainty and faith that had occupied ancient philosophers and theologians for centuries. Orpheus would be required to maintain confidence in Eurydice's presence, based solely on auditory evidence, the sound of her footsteps, the whisper of her breathing, the rustle of her garments as she moved through the underground passages. Any attempt to confirm her presence through direct visual contact would immediately nullify the agreement and return her permanently to the realm of the dead. Ancient sources suggest that Hades chose this particular condition because it reflected the fundamental nature of the relationship between life and death, requiring living beings to proceed forward without constantly looking backward toward what they had lost. The restriction embodied philosophical principles about the necessity of accepting uncertainty and maintaining hope despite the absence of absolute proof, themes that resonated throughout Greek religious thought and provided the foundation for various mystery cults that promised initiates knowledge about the afterlife and the possibility of achieving blessed existence beyond mortal death. The practical implementation of this condition created additional challenges that Hades did not explicitly address, but which became apparent as soon as Orpheus began his return journey. The Underworld's geography included numerous obstacles, alternative pathways, and potential hazards that normally required careful visual navigation to traverse safely. Orpheus would need to guide both himself and Eurydice through this treacherous terrain while relying primarily on memory, sound, and his supernatural senses to avoid dangers that could separate them permanently or trap them both in regions from which escape might prove impossible. Persephone's role in facilitating Eurydice's release reflected her unique position as a goddess who had experienced both traumatic separation from loved ones and eventual reconciliation that created new forms of relationship transcending the normal boundaries between different realms of existence. Her intervention ensured that Eurydice would be restored to her full physical form and supernatural abilities, rather than returning as a mere shade or diminished version of her former self. This restoration required complex magical processes that drew upon Persephone's authority over seasonal cycles and her understanding of the transitions between life and death that governed natural renewal. The moment of Eurydice's restoration created visible effects throughout the throne room as life force flowed back into her insubstantial form, gradually rebuilding the physical and spiritual structures that had been dissolved at the moment of her death. Her appearance began to regain the luminous quality that had characterized her nymphal nature, while her connection to the natural world slowly re-established itself, despite the hostile environment of the Underworld. The process required several minutes to complete, during which Orpheus was required to maintain his position, facing away from the throne area, while listening to the subtle sounds that indicated his beloved's return to full existence. The assembled court witnessed this unprecedented reversal of death with a mixture of awe and concern about the potential consequences of establishing such a dramatic precedent. The judges of the dead began immediate consultations about how this exception might affect their future decisions regarding souls who claimed similar circumstances or exceptional relationships that might justify comparable treatment. The Furies expressed particular concern about how the restoration of Eurydice might influence their ongoing responsibilities for ensuring that cosmic justice remained effective in deterring moral violations throughout the mortal world. The administrative implications of Orpheus's success extended beyond immediate concerns about precedent to encompass broader questions about the efficiency and reliability of underworld operations if exceptions to death's finality became more common. The complex bureaucratic systems that managed the eternal fates of countless souls had been designed around the assumption that death represented an irreversible transition that eliminated the need for ongoing adjustments or appeals processes. Introducing the possibility of resurrection under exceptional circumstances would require fundamental restructuring of these systems to accommodate the additional complexity, The actual beginning of the return journey occurred without ceremony, as Hades dismissed the court and directed Orpheus to commence his departure immediately, while the magical forces maintaining Eurydice's restoration remained at their peak effectiveness. The god's final instructions emphasized the absolute nature of the imposed condition, while warning that any violation, however slight or well-intentioned, would result in immediate and permanent forfeiture of the granted exception. These warnings carried particular weight because they came from a deity whose authority over death was absolute and whose previous decisions had never been subject to appeal or modification. Orpheus began his ascent through the Underworld's labyrinthine passages with heightened awareness of every sound that might indicate Eurydice's presence behind him. The soft whisper of her footsteps on the stone floors provided reassurance that she was indeed following, while the occasional rustle of fabric or quiet intake of breath confirmed that her restoration to physical form had been successful and complete. These auditory confirmations became his primary source of comfort and guidance as he navigated the complex route that would eventually return them both to the world of the living. The early stages of their journey proceeded without significant incident, as the passages immediately surrounding Hades' palace were well maintained and clearly marked to facilitate the movement of official underworld business. The acoustic properties of these areas provided excellent sound transmission, allowing Orpheus to monitor Eurydice's progress with reasonable confidence while maintaining the forward focus required by his agreement with the Underworld's rulers. The familiar weight of his golden lyre carried across his shoulder served as a reminder of the musical abilities that had made their reunion possible. The psychological challenges of the journey became more apparent as they progressed through increasingly remote and treacherous sections of the Underworld's geography. The natural human tendency to look back and verify that loved ones were safe and present required constant conscious suppression, creating mental strain that intensified as the journey continued. Orpheus found himself developing elaborate strategies for resisting the impulse to turn around, including focusing intensely on the path ahead, creating mental compositions that required complete concentration, and deliberately engaging with environmental challenges that demanded his full attention. The passage through Tartarus created particular difficulties, because the sounds of eternal punishment that characterized this region often masked the subtle audio cues that Orpheus relied upon to confirm Eurydice's presence. The screams of tormented souls, the clash of supernatural implements of torture, and the roar of fires that burned without consuming their fuel created a cacophony that made it nearly impossible to distinguish the quiet sounds of his beloved's movements from the general chaos surrounding them. These acoustic challenges forced him to slow their pace considerably while straining to detect any indication that she remained behind him. The encounter with Cerberus during their return passage required careful negotiation, as the three-headed guardian had resumed his normal duties following Orpheus's initial performance, and showed no inclination to provide automatic passage for their departure. The creature's response to their approach suggested recognition of their previous interaction, but also indicated that his temporary pacification had not created any permanent change in his fundamental nature or responsibilities. Orpheus was required to perform another musical intervention while maintaining his forward-facing orientation, creating technical challenges that tested his ability to project his music effectively without visual confirmation of its impact. The successful passage beyond Cerberus marked their transition from the deepest regions of the underworld to the intermediate zones where administrative processing occurred, and newly arrived souls awaited judgment. These areas featured more conventional architecture and lighting conditions that created familiar reference points for navigation, though the requirement to avoid looking back continued to create psychological pressure that intensified as they approached regions where escape seemed increasingly possible. The sounds of Eurydice's presence remained audible and reassuring, though Orpheus began to notice subtle changes in her breathing patterns that suggested the strain of their journey was affecting her as well. The crossing of the river Styx required coordination with Charon, whose ferry service operated according to strict protocols that did not automatically accommodate unusual circumstances like their current situation. The ferryman's recognition of their previous interaction facilitated their passage, but the crossing itself created new challenges as the boat's movement and the sound of water against its hull made it more difficult to distinguish Eurydice's presence from other ambient sounds. The journey across the dark waters seemed to take much longer than their initial crossing, though this perception might have resulted from Orpheus's heightened anxiety about maintaining the conditions required for their successful escape. The final stages of their ascent through the natural cave systems that connected the underworld to the surface world created the most severe psychological pressure of their entire journey. The gradually improving lighting conditions and increasingly familiar geological formations provided clear evidence that they were approaching their goal, creating powerful temptations to turn and share the moment of anticipated triumph with his beloved. The sounds of surface world activity, wind through trees, distant bird songs, the rustle of leaves, began to filter down through the cave openings, creating emotional responses that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the disciplined focus required by their agreement with Hades. The acoustic properties of the ascending passages created new challenges for monitoring Eurydice's presence, as echoes and reverberations made it difficult to distinguish between sounds originating from her movements and reflections of his own footsteps bouncing off the cave walls. The uncertainty created by these acoustic distortions generated increasing anxiety that she might have fallen behind, become lost in the complex passage system, or encountered obstacles that prevented her from maintaining the pace required for their synchronized ascent to the surface world. The moment of fatal weakness occurred just as the first rays of actual sunlight became visible through the cave opening that marked their final exit from the underworld's domain. The sight of natural light streaming into the passage created an overwhelming surge of joy and relief that temporarily displaced the careful self-discipline that had sustained Orpheus throughout their arduous journey. The knowledge that they had almost achieved the impossible goal of returning from death created emotions so powerful that they overcame his rational understanding of the conditions that still governed their escape. The impulse to turn and look at Eurydice arose from the most fundamental aspects of human nature: the desire to share moments of triumph with loved ones, the need for visual confirmation of safety and success, and the irresistible urge to express love and gratitude through direct eye contact. These natural responses, which would have been appropriate and beneficial under normal circumstances, became the instrument of ultimate tragedy when applied to a situation that required supernatural levels of self-control and faith in divine promises that could not be verified through normal sensory experience. The actual moment of turning lasted only a fraction of a second, but its consequences proved immediate and irreversible. Orpheus caught a brief glimpse of Eurydice's beloved face, illuminated by the sunlight streaming through the cave opening and displaying an expression that combined joy at their near success with sudden realization that his action had doomed them both. Her form began dissolving even as he watched, the physical restoration that Persephone had granted her unravelling as the violated condition triggered the automatic enforcement of their agreement with the underworld's rulers. Eurydice's final words, spoken as her form faded back into insubstantial shadow, carried no anger or recrimination despite the fact that Orpheus's moment of weakness had cost them both their chance at a renewed life together. Her expression of love and understanding, even in the face of this ultimate disappointment, demonstrated the depth of her character and the genuine nature of the relationship that had motivated their entire impossible journey. Her farewell acknowledged both the magnitude of what Orpheus had attempted on her behalf and her acceptance of the fate that his human limitations had made inevitable. The completion of her dissolution left Orpheus standing alone at the threshold between the underworld and the surface world, holding only memories of their brief reunion and the echo of her final words of love and forgiveness. The sunlight that had seemed to promise their salvation now illuminated only his solitary figure, while the cave opening that should have marked their triumphant return to life instead became the site of their final separation. The golden lyre that had enabled their temporary reunion felt heavier than ever before, its cosmic harmonies now serving only to amplify the silence left by Eurydice's permanent departure. The return to the upper world transformed Orpheus into a figure fundamentally altered by his encounter with the ultimate boundaries of divine power and cosmic order. The sunlight that had promised salvation now felt harsh, against skin that had grown accustomed to the underworld's perpetual twilight, while familiar sounds of wind through leaves and flowing water carried painful reminders of the natural harmony he had once shared with Eurydice. The golden lyre that had enabled his unprecedented journey to the realm of the dead remained his constant companion, but its cosmic harmonies now served primarily to express the profound grief that had become the defining characteristic of his existence. The immediate aftermath of his second loss revealed the complete breakdown of his previous relationship with human society and divine community alike. Fellow heroes who had sailed with him aboard the Argo attempted to offer comfort and companionship, but Orpheus found their presence unbearable reminders of the collaborative relationships that had once given a meaning to his existence. The Muses, including his mother Calliope, descended from their mountain sanctuaries to provide support, but even their divine understanding could not bridge the gap that had opened between his transformed consciousness and the normal patterns of interaction that governed both mortal and immortal social relationships. The physical changes that accompanied his psychological transformation became apparent to those who encountered him during his wanderings through the Thracian wilderness. His divine heritage had always given him an appearance that transcended normal human limitations, but the trauma of his underworld journey and the loss of Eurydice created visible alterations that reflected his internal state. His hair, previously golden like Apollo's own, began showing streaks of premature grey that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. His eyes, once bright with the creative fire that drove his musical innovations, developed a distant quality that suggested his attention remained focused on realms beyond normal perception. The rejection of human companionship extended beyond simple preference for solitude to encompass active avoidance of all social interactions that might require him to engage with the concerns and activities that occupied normal existence. Invitations to perform at festivals, weddings, and religious ceremonies went unanswered as Orpheus retreated deeper into remote regions where his presence would not disturb communities or individuals seeking to maintain conventional relationships with the divine powers that governed their daily lives. His withdrawal from public life created a void in Thracian cultural activities that had previously centered around his musical performances and their beneficial effects on agricultural productivity and social harmony. The hermit existence that Orpheus adopted involved establishing temporary shelters in locations that provided natural acoustic properties, suitable for the type of musical expression that had become his sole remaining connection to purposeful activity. Mountain caves with complex echo chambers allowed him to create compositions that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, while forest clearings surrounded by specific arrangements of trees provided resonance patterns that amplified his music's emotional intensity. These performance spaces became known to local populations as places where supernatural music could be heard at dawn and dusk, though few dared approach closely enough to observe the solitary figure responsible for these haunting melodies. The musical compositions that Orpheus created during this period of isolation represented a complete departure from his previous works, which had typically celebrated harmony, beauty, and the positive aspects of existence. His new pieces focused exclusively on themes of loss, separation, and the futility of attempting to transcend the limitations that defined both mortal and divine experience. The technical complexity of these compositions exceeded anything he'd previously achieved, as his grief drove him to explore musical possibilities that required supernatural levels of skill and emotional intensity to execute effectively. The laments that characterized his hermit period achieved effects on the natural world that surpassed even his earlier demonstrations of musical power over environmental phenomena. Trees that heard his sorrowful melodies would shed their leaves regardless of season, creating patches of premature autumn that persisted until the emotional resonance of his music finally dissipated. Streams and rivers altered their courses to flow around areas where he performed, as if the water itself sought to avoid contamination by the profound sadness that permeated his musical expression. Wild animals that encountered his music displayed unprecedented behaviors, with predators abandoning their hunting activities and gathering in groups that reflected the communal mourning his compositions seemed to inspire. The period of wandering that followed his initial retreat from civilization took Orpheus throughout the mountainous regions of Thrace, where his presence created temporary disruptions in the normal patterns of seasonal change and agricultural productivity. Farmers reported that crops planted in areas where he'd recently performed failed to mature properly, while fruit trees produced harvests that tasted bitter despite appearing healthy and abundant. These agricultural disruptions reflected the way his transformed musical abilities now influenced natural processes, creating effects that paralleled his internal state, rather than promoting the harmony and fertility that had characterized his earlier interventions. The psychological isolation that defined Orpheus's hermit existence extended beyond simple physical separation from other conscious beings to encompass a fundamental disconnection from the cosmic principles that had previously given structure and meaning to his existence. His divine heritage as Apollo's son had originally provided him with understanding of universal harmony and his role in maintaining the balance between opposing forces that governed natural and supernatural phenomena. The trauma of losing Eurydice twice had shattered this understanding, leaving him unable to perceive purpose or pattern in the cosmic order that had once seemed perfectly comprehensible and benevolent. The rejection of divine community proved as complete as his avoidance of mortal society, with Orpheus refusing to participate in Olympian gatherings or respond to communications from other deities who attempted to provide guidance or support during his period of grief. Apollo himself made several attempts to reconnect with his son, appearing in various forms during Orpheus's mountain wanderings, to offer comfort and perspective that might help restore his psychological equilibrium. These divine interventions proved unsuccessful, as Orpheus had lost faith in the benevolence and wisdom of the cosmic order that the Olympian gods represented and maintained through their various spheres of influence. The duration of Orpheus's hermit period varied according to different ancient sources, with some traditions suggesting it lasted several years, while others indicated that his isolation continued for decades before the circumstances that would lead to his death finally developed. Archaeological evidence from Thracian sites associated with Orpheus worship suggests that local populations maintained awareness of his presence in their region despite his avoidance of direct contact, with ritual offerings left at locations where his music had been heard and shrines established at sites where his performances had created lasting changes in the natural environment. The gradual development of his reputation as a figure to be avoided rather than sought out reflected the transformation of his musical abilities from beneficial to potentially dangerous for those who encountered them unprepared. Shepherds reported that livestock exposed to his laments would refuse to eat for days afterward, while travellers who heard his music while passing through remote mountain areas often became lost for extended periods as the emotional intensity of his compositions disrupted their ability to navigate familiar terrain. These effects created a growing awareness among Thracian populations that the divine musician who had once been a source of cultural pride and agricultural prosperity had become something far more ambiguous and potentially threatening. The specific locations where Orpheus established his temporary residences during this period became associated with supernatural phenomena that persisted long after his departure, creating sites that later generations would recognize as sacred to his memory, despite the tragic circumstances that had created their significance. Mountain springs that had provided him with drinking water developed properties that could induce prophetic visions in those who consumed them, while caves where he had sheltered began producing unusual acoustic effects that seemed to preserve echoes of his music indefinitely. These environmental changes provided physical evidence of his presence and influence that would contribute to the development of Orphic religious traditions in subsequent centuries. The accounts of Orpheus's death preserved in classical sources present multiple versions that reflect different regional traditions and varying interpretations of the symbolic significance of his final fate. The most widely accepted tradition attributes his death to the Thracian Maenads, female followers of Dionysus whose religious practices involved ecstatic rituals that could escalate into violence when participants achieved states of divine possession. These women encountered Orpheus during one of their ceremonial gatherings and became enraged by his continued rejection of all human companionship, interpreting his behaviour as an insult to their god and a threat to the social bonds that their religious activities were designed to strengthen and celebrate. The specific circumstances that led to the fatal encounter varied according to different ancient authors, with some sources suggesting that the Maenads approached Orpheus with invitations to participate in their Dionysiac festivities, only to be rebuffed with such coldness that their religious enthusiasm transformed into murderous fury. Other versions indicate that his mere presence in areas where they were conducting their rituals created disruptions that interfered with their ability to achieve the ecstatic states that formed the central focus of their religious experience. His music, now focused entirely on themes of loss and despair, proved incompatible with the celebratory and life-affirming aspects of Dionysiac worship. Alternative explanations for the Maenads' hostility toward Orpheus centred on his rejection of all female companionship following Eurydice's death, which some traditions interpreted as evidence that he had begun exclusively seeking romantic relationships with young men. This behavioural change, if accurate, would have represented a significant departure from conventional social norms that governed interactions between divine figures and mortal populations. The Maenads' violent response might have reflected their perception that his exclusive preference for male companions constituted an insult to their gender and a rejection of the natural relationships between men and women that formed the foundation of social organisation. The actual attack that resulted in Orpheus's death occurred during the height of a Dionysiac festival, when the participating Maenads had achieved states of religious ecstasy that eliminated normal moral restraints and social inhibitions. Ancient sources describe how they initially attempted to drown out his sorrowful music with their own celebratory songs and the clash of ceremonial instruments. But his supernatural abilities proved too powerful for conventional musical competition. The failure of their attempts to overcome his influence through normal means escalated their response to physical violence that quickly spiraled beyond any possibility of control or moderation. The dismemberment that followed represented the ultimate expression of Dionysiac religious fury, with the frenzied women tearing Orpheus apart with their bare hands in a display of supernatural strength that reflected their divine possession. The violence continued until his body had been completely destroyed, with fragments scattered across the landscape where the attack occurred. This extreme brutality reflected both the intensity of their religious ecstasy and the magnitude of the perceived insult that had triggered their murderous response to his presence in their sacred space. Some ancient sources suggest that Dionysus himself orchestrated Orpheus's death as punishment for the musician's failure to honour the god of wine and ecstatic celebration during his period of mourning. This interpretation positioned the tragedy as divine justice rather than random violence, with Orpheus's exclusive focus on grief and loss representing a rejection of the life-affirming aspects of existence that Dionysus embodied and promoted through his religious cult. The god's involvement would explain the supernatural strength that enabled the Maenads to destroy a figure whose divine heritage should have provided protection against normal human violence. Alternative traditions preserve different explanations for Orpheus's death that reflected varying theological perspectives on the relationship between divine justice and individual suffering. Some sources attributed his demise to Zeus, who struck him down with lightning as punishment for revealing divine secrets to mortal initiates during his development of mystery religion teachings. This version positioned his death as the consequence of violating the boundaries that separated divine knowledge from human understanding, with his musical abilities having provided access to cosmic truths that were not meant for mortal comprehension. The immediate aftermath of Orpheus's violent death created supernatural phenomena that demonstrated the continued power of his divine nature even after the destruction of his physical form. His severed head, still capable of song, was carried by the river Hebrus toward the Aegean Sea, continuing to produce melodies of such beauty and sorrow that the waters themselves seemed to weep in response to his music. The lyre, separated from its master's hands during the dismemberment, floated alongside the singing head while maintaining its ability to generate harmonious accompaniment to the vocal expressions that emerged from his lifeless lips. The journey of Orpheus's head and lyre down the Hebrus River created a procession of mourning that affected every community along the waterway, with local populations gathering at riverbanks to witness the passage of these relics and to hear the final compositions that emerged from his supernatural remains. The music that accompanied this posthumous journey differed from the sorrowful laments that had characterized his hermit period, instead expressing themes of acceptance and transcendence that suggested his death had restored his understanding of cosmic harmony and his place within the universal order that governed both life and death. The arrival of Orpheus's remains at the island of Lesbos marked the conclusion of his physical journey and the beginning of his transformation into a figure of religious significance that would influence Greek spiritual traditions for centuries to come. The inhabitants of Lesbos, renowned throughout the ancient world for their musical sophistication and poetic achievements, recognized the significance of these supernatural relics and established appropriate shrines where the head and lyre could receive the veneration they deserved. The continued ability of these remains to produce music created a pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from throughout the Mediterranean world, seeking to experience the final expressions of the greatest musician in mythological history. The violent death of Orpheus marked not the end of his influence, but rather the beginning of a transformation that would establish him as one of the most significant religious figures in ancient Greek spiritual development. The supernatural circumstances surrounding his dismemberment and the continued musical activity of his severed remains created immediate recognition among contemporary populations that his death represented a cosmic event requiring appropriate religious response. Local Thracian communities, despite their previous avoidance of his hermit presence, began establishing shrines at locations where fragments of his body had been discovered, creating the earliest physical foundations for what would eventually develop into a comprehensive mystery religion bearing his name. The establishment of Orphic religious mysteries drew upon the theological implications of his unprecedented journey to the Underworld and successful negotiation with Hades and Persephone for Eurydice's temporary return. These experiences positioned Orpheus as the only figure in Greek mythology who possessed direct, personal knowledge of the Underworld's geography, administrative systems, and the specific conditions governing the afterlife experiences of deceased souls. His musical abilities had demonstrated the power of properly applied artistic expression to influence even the most fundamental cosmic forces, including the apparently absolute boundary between life and death that had previously seemed impermeable to mortal intervention. The core teachings attributed to Orpheus in ancient mystery traditions centered on the soul's journey through multiple existences and the possibility of achieving purification that could break the cycle of death and rebirth that normally governed human spiritual development. These doctrines represented a significant departure from conventional Greek religious thought, which typically portrayed death as a final transition to a shadowy existence in Hades that bore little resemblance to the vibrant experiences of mortal life. Orphic teachings instead proposed that death represented merely one stage in an ongoing process of spiritual evolution that could ultimately lead to permanent reunion with divine consciousness. The mystery initiations that claimed Orphic authority typically involved ritual reenactments of his underworld journey, with participants undergoing symbolic death and resurrection experiences designed to prepare them for the actual transitions they would face following their physical deaths. These ceremonies incorporated musical elements that drew upon his legendary abilities to influence supernatural forces through harmonic manipulation, though the specific techniques employed in historical mystery cults necessarily represented simplified versions of the cosmic-level interventions attributed to Orpheus himself in mythological accounts. Archaeological evidence from various Mediterranean sites associated with Orphic mystery religions reveals the sophisticated ritual apparatus that developed around these teachings during the classical and Hellenistic periods. Underground chambers carved into natural rock formations provided spaces for initiation ceremonies that replicated the cave environments through which Orpheus had travelled during his descent to Hades. These installations often featured complex acoustic properties that enhanced musical performances while creating the disorienting sensory experiences that mystery religions use to induce altered states of consciousness in their participants. Inscriptions discovered at Orphic ritual sites preserve fragments of the religious literature that form the textual foundation for these mystery traditions. These documents include detailed maps of underworld geography, instructions for navigating the various challenges that souls would encounter following death, and specific passwords or formulaic phrases that would enable deceased initiates to gain favourable treatment from infernal authorities. The precision and consistency of these materials across different geographical locations suggests the existence of organised teaching traditions that maintained standardised versions of Orphic doctrine despite the decentralised nature of mystery cult organisation. The influence of Orphic religious concepts on later Greek philosophical schools proved particularly significant in the development of Pythagoreanism, where mathematical principles governing musical harmony became central to understanding cosmic order and the soul's relationship to universal structure. Pythagoras himself was traditionally associated with Orphic teachings, with ancient sources suggesting that he had received direct instruction from Orphic mystery priests during his travels in southern Italy and Sicily. The Pythagorean emphasis on numerical relationships underlying both musical composition and astronomical phenomena reflected Orphic insights about the fundamental unity connecting artistic expression, natural law, and spiritual development. The mathematical approach to understanding harmonic relationships that characterized Pythagorean philosophy provided scientific foundations for concepts that Orphic mythology had expressed through narrative and ritual symbolism. The discovery that musical intervals corresponding to simple numerical ratios produced the most aesthetically pleasing harmonic combinations suggested that beauty itself reflected underlying mathematical principles governing cosmic organization. This insight supported Orphic claims that properly composed music could influence supernatural forces by aligning human artistic expression with the numerical patterns that maintained universal order. Pythagorean communities that developed in Greek colonial cities throughout the Western Mediterranean incorporated Orphic ritual practices into their philosophical curricula, creating educational programs that combined mathematical instruction with mystery religion initiations. Students in these schools underwent training in both theoretical music composition and practical performance techniques that were designed to develop their ability to perceive and manipulate the harmonic relationships connecting individual consciousness with cosmic consciousness. The goal of this integrated education was to produce individuals capable of achieving the type of spiritual transcendence that Orpheus had demonstrated through his musical interventions in divine affairs. The relationship between Orphic teachings and Platonic philosophy proved even more influential in shaping subsequent Western intellectual development, with Plato incorporating numerous Orphic concepts into his systematic exploration of reality, knowledge, and the soul's immortal nature. The Platonic distinction between the material world of appearances and the eternal realm of perfect forms reflected Orphic insights about the temporary nature of physical existence and the soul's ultimate destiny to transcend bodily limitations through philosophical purification. Plato's famous allegory of the cave, with its imagery of prisoners bound in underground chambers who mistake shadows for reality, drew directly upon Orphic descriptions of the soul's imprisonment in physical matter and its potential liberation through proper understanding of spiritual truth. The Platonic academy that developed in Athens during the 4th century BCE became a major centre for preserving and transmitting Orphic philosophical concepts to subsequent generations of Greek and Roman intellectuals. Academic discussions of the soul's immortality, the process of reincarnation, and the possibility of achieving permanent escape from the cycle of death and rebirth reflected sophisticated theological analysis of themes that Orphic mystery religions had originally presented through mythological narratives and ritual symbolism. This philosophical development transformed Orphic insights from esoteric religious teachings accessible only to mystery cult initiates into systematic doctrines that could be studied and debated within conventional educational institutions. The corpus of Orphic literature that developed during the Hellenistic and Roman periods included hundreds of texts attributed to Orpheus himself, covering topics ranging from cosmological speculation to practical instructions for ritual purification and spiritual development. These writings, collectively known as the Orphica, represented one of the most extensive religious literary traditions in the ancient world, with individual works addressing specific aspects of Orphic doctrine while maintaining overall consistency in their fundamental theological assumptions. Modern scholarly analysis has determined that virtually none of these texts were actually composed by historical figures contemporary with the mythological Orpheus, but rather represent the accumulated wisdom of mystery cult teachers who used his authority to legitimize their religious innovations. The Orphic hymns, a collection of 87 religious poems addressed to various deities and supernatural forces, provided standardized liturgical materials for mystery cult ceremonies while preserving theological concepts that reflected sophisticated understanding of divine nature and cosmic organization. These compositions demonstrated the continued influence of Orpheus's musical legacy on religious practice, with their complex metrical structures and elaborate mythological references requiring considerable artistic skill to perform effectively. The hymns addressed not only major Olympian deities, but also obscure supernatural figures associated with underworld geography and the soul's posthumous journey, indicating the specialized knowledge that Orphic religious traditions had developed regarding afterlife experiences. The Orphic Argonautica, a lengthy epic poem describing the voyage of Jason and his companions from Orpheus's perspective, provided an alternative version of familiar mythological material that emphasized the religious significance of the expedition and Orpheus's role as spiritual guide for his heroic companions. This work presented the quest for the Golden Fleece as an allegory for the soul's journey towards spiritual purification, with the various challenges encountered during the voyage, representing obstacles that individual consciousness must overcome to achieve divine understanding. The poem's detailed descriptions of Orpheus's musical interventions during supernatural encounters provided practical examples of how artistic expression could serve religious purposes. The influence of Orphic concepts on Roman religious development became particularly apparent during the late Republican and early Imperial periods, when traditional Roman religious practices proved inadequate to address the spiritual needs of populations throughout the expanding Mediterranean Empire. Orphic mystery cults provided alternative religious experiences that emphasized individual salvation and personal relationship with divine forces, concepts that appealed to urban populations who had become disconnected from the agricultural festivals and civic ceremonies that form the foundation of traditional Roman religious life. The promise of achieving blessed afterlife existence through proper ritual preparation attracted followers from all social classes, including members of the imperial family who sought spiritual assurance that their earthly power would translate into posthumous benefits. The enduring impact of Orpheus on Western literature extended far beyond ancient Greek and Roman sources to encompass medieval, Renaissance, and modern artistic traditions that continue to find inspiration in his mythological experiences and their symbolic significance for understanding human relationships with love, loss, and transcendence. Medieval Christian authors interpreted his underworld journey as a prefiguration of Christ's descent into hell and resurrection, while Renaissance poets and composers used his story to explore themes of artistic inspiration and the power of beauty to overcome death and destruction. The continued relevance of Orphic themes in contemporary literature and music demonstrates the universal appeal of concepts that ancient mystery religions had originally developed through their interpretation of his legendary experiences. The artistic representations of Orpheus that appeared throughout ancient Mediterranean visual culture provided additional evidence for his widespread cultural influence and the diverse ways that different communities understood his significance. Greek pottery from the 6th and 5th centuries BC frequently depicted scenes from his various mythological adventures, with particular emphasis on his musical performances and their effects on natural phenomena. These artistic works often emphasized the civilizing influence of his music, showing wild animals gathered peacefully around him while he played, or depicting the construction of cities whose walls rose in response to his harmonious compositions. Roman mosaics and wall paintings found in domestic and religious contexts throughout the empire continued these artistic traditions, while adding new elements that reflected contemporary understanding of Orphic religious significance. Imperial period artworks often portrayed Orpheus in contexts that emphasized his role as a religious teacher and guide for souls seeking salvation, with imagery that connected his mythological experiences to the mystery cult practices that had developed around his teachings. These visual representations served both decorative and educational purposes, familiarizing viewers with Orphic concepts while providing inspiration for personal spiritual development. The preservation of Orphic traditions through the medieval period occurred primarily within Islamic intellectual circles, where Greek philosophical and religious texts were translated and studied by scholars who recognized their continued relevance for understanding cosmic principles and human spiritual potential. Islamic philosophers such as Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina incorporated Orphic concepts about the soul's immortality and its relationship to universal harmony into their systematic explorations of metaphysical questions, ensuring that these ancient insights remained available to later European thinkers who would rediscover Greek learning during the Renaissance period. The Renaissance revival of interest in ancient mystery religions brought renewed attention to Orphic teachings and their potential applications to contemporary spiritual and artistic pursuits. Humanist scholars such as Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola studied Orphic texts as sources of ancient wisdom that could complement and enhance Christian theological understanding, while artists and musicians sought to recreate the transformative effects that ancient sources attributed to Orpheus's divine musical abilities. This scholarly and artistic revival established foundations for the continued study of Orphic traditions that would influence European intellectual development through the Enlightenment and into the modern period. The legacy of Orpheus thus represents one of the most comprehensive and enduring influences in Western cultural history, extending from ancient mystery religions through medieval Islamic scholarship to Renaissance humanism and beyond into contemporary artistic and spiritual traditions. His mythological experiences provided archetypal patterns for understanding fundamental human concerns about love, loss, death, and the possibility of transcendence that remain relevant across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The religious, philosophical and artistic traditions that developed around his figure demonstrate the capacity of mythological narratives to generate ongoing intellectual and spiritual innovation while maintaining connection to the essential human experiences that originally inspired their creation. Through the establishment of mystery religions, influence on major philosophical schools, preservation in extensive literary traditions, and continued inspiration for artistic expression, Orpheus achieved the immortality that his own journey to the underworld had sought, becoming a permanent presence in the cultural consciousness of Western civilization, whose influence continues to shape contemporary understanding of art's power to address humanity's deepest spiritual longings.